Hello and welcome to the official Magic the Gathering mana fixing tier list. Now, I've been wanting to make this video for a while, and some of you guys who know me probably understand why I'm doing this, but in my videos, in my draft decks and mixed decks I create, I usually have some ridiculous mana base that works for whatever reason, right? It comes together and works. And a lot of times I jokingly say things like, well, it's because I have card draw that fixes my mana, or I have time walk and that, gives me an extra turn, helps me fix my mana. And then, sometimes there's like, I have fetches and duels. So I figured it makes sense for me to just make the official tier list ranking mana fixing of all types from something as ridiculous as Naked Singularity all the way up to like fetches and duels, or there is one card in S tier. We'll get to that in a second, or not a second, but you'll figure out what that is in a bit. And let's just get started. So I figured a basic land is a pretty good starting point. This is like the definitive mana fixing that Magic created in the beginning. Taps for one color. I'm going to put basic land, I'm just showing island here, in E tier. It's kind of in the middle of the road. It adds mana, but it doesn't fix your mana. It just adds one color, so it's hard to get multiple colors this way. Alright, next up we have Trenchcourter. So Trenchcourter is probably a card many of you have not seen, but it says when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for any number of land cards, exile them, and then shuffle your library. And then it gets power and toughness. But what this card does is you can, let's say you have only blue lands and you're looking to get mountains. You can exile all of your non-red lands from your deck, and then you'll just have mountains left over. So it's not great, but technically it is mana fixing in a pinch if you need it. I want to put Trenchcourter at H tier, because there are things worse than this, believe me. Rampant Growth is a pretty popular card, and I'm going to use this to represent all types of cards that search your library for a land and put it into play. So you can go anywhere from Rampant Growth to like Boundless Realms or whatever that searches for a bunch. I'm just going to kind of put these all together, and these would be higher in the tier list if they weren't exclusively restricted to green, or white has a couple we'll talk about, but it's mostly green. So I think for that reason, I want to put Rampant Growth in the D tier list because it's very good, but it's limited to just green as a color. Next, we have Training Center, or there's a whole cycle of these for Commander. Basically, if you have more than 2 or more opponents, they enter untapped. So these are very similar to dual lands, but they're just a step below because they don't have that basic land typing, which can be an advantage. There's like things like Sundering Titan, which kill them, but most of the time, being able to fetch up an untapped duel makes it better. So when we get to duels, this is going to be slightly below the dual lands, and that's going to put it in C tier. Low C tier. I guess the tiers are kind of non-linear, so dual lands might be in C tier, but this will be like at the bottom, for example. Then we have Metamorphose, and this card is kind of similar to Rampant Growth in that it's limited to red and green, but I think there are a couple benefits. The first is that it enters untapped, or like you get the mana immediately, and it adds 2 mana of any combination of colors, so you can from only green mana, you can cast Metamorphose and get a double black card. I've definitely used this to splash Tendrils into like a mono red storm list where I had no other black sources aside from Metamorphose. So I think Metamorphose is actually very, very good fixing because it adds 1 mana in any combination of colors. So I'm going to put Metamorphose in like high B tier or low A tier. The only problem is that it's limited to 2 colors of mana. And in a similar vein to Metamorphose, we have Chromatic Star. This is colorless to add 1 mana of any color. I think this would be worse than Metamorphose in general because it takes a mana to do it. You have to spend a mana and then it only generates 1. So you're down a mana in the exchange. So I think I'm going to put this probably in C tier, but it could also be in low B tier. I think I'm going to do C tier actually. It is a little bit worse than Metamorphose for that regard. Next up is Springleaf Drum, and this is similar to Chromatic Star in that, it's 1 for 1 of any color, but it has the extra requirement that you need a creature in play. So for that reason, I think it's going to be a tier down from Chromatic Star. We're going to put it in D tier right next to Rampant Growth because both of these require you to have something. Rampant Growth requires you to have green sources. Springleaf Drum requires you to have creatures. And this brings us to Ash Barrens, which is again similar to those two, but the main benefit of Ash Barrens is that first of all, it actually fixes for colorless, because colorless is now a color in Magic for whatever reason, so you can use this to cast Eldrazi. And then you can cycle it for a basic land, and it can enter untapped. So it's similar to Rampant Growth and things like that, in that it searches for a land, but it's in any color, and the land can come in untapped if you have an available land drop. So I think Ash Barrens is going to go up to C tier. Ah man, Cascade Bluffs, this whole cycle of lands is some of my favorite. They're really fun in EDH where you play like ridiculous mana costs. So basically it also filters for colorless. And then you can, if you have blue or red, you can basically get any of the double colored combinations. So I think this land is very context dependent. It's largely played in Commander where you have a lot of double costed or like triple costed mana costs. So if you're playing in Commander, I think this would come in at C tier. But because it's not so useful in Constructed or other formats, I'm going to put it at D tier. But just know, like, this is very format dependent. I love this card, and I think effects of this type are really strong and fun. It just depends on, you know, if you're trying to cast, like, Niv Mizzet compared to, like, other constructed spells. Ah, yes, good old Urza's Tower. And this is kind of representing the entire Tron land. So they are somewhat mana fixing in that if you assemble all three of them, you get access to 7 colorless. And I don't mean that in fixing like how much colorless you have. Like maybe you just need more colorless than you currently have. So in a sense, this is kind of helping you hit like, I don't know why you would be needing 7 colorless mana on one turn, but I think there are activated abilities that require colorless mana. So if you hit Tron, this does help fix your mana over just playing a basic wastes. I'm going to put this in H tier. It does a thing, but it's similar to Trench Gorger where it doesn't do it very well. And the thing it does is very niche. I don't know why you need 7 specifically colorless mana, but it's possible you get there. So we'll put Urza's Tower in H. Ooh, here's a fun one. Blue Mana Battery. I actually didn't know this card existed. So this is 4 mana for an artifact that at the base rate can just tap for blue, but then you can put charge counters on it. So you can, in theory, tap this for double blue or triple blue. So I think this is better mana fixing than a basic land because this on its own can tap for double blue. Oh, I still have the search up. Whoops. This on its own can tap for double blue. So I'm still going to put it in E tier because I think this card is definitely worse than Rampant Growth because it only taps for blue, not 1 mana of any color, or like you get to choose when it comes in. But it's in an E tier that is higher than a basic land because you can hit these more, like this can cast a Trench Gorger, for example, whereas you would need 2 islands to do that. Ooh, Gemstone Array is very fun. I love this card in Commander as well. So for 2 mana, you can put a charge counter on it, and then you can remove a charge counter to add 1 mana of any color. So this is great mana fixing. It's also mana storage. Like if you have leftover mana at the end of turn, you can just put charge counters on this and then use them on your turn or whatever. You can also proliferate it. I think this card's fantastic. Really good mana fixing. I'm going to put this in at a solid B tier. Very similar to Manamorphose. I think this card, it's better than Manamorphose in that it's more flexible, but I think Manamorphose is like a better rate. So again, I think in Commander, Gemstone Array is better than Manamorphose. In like constructed formats, Gemstone Array drops a lot. But I think the raw power is there, enough to put it in B tier. Next up is Channel the Suns. So I have other rituals, which I'll put in a separate category because most rituals just add mana of 1 color type. And this adds mana of all 5. So if you hit green, you basically get immediate access to all 5 colors. And so I think as from like a mana fixing standpoint, this is on par with Rampant Growth, but a little bit better because you get the mana immediately versus entering tapped. So I think I'm going to put this one actually in C tier, but it's kind of a low C tier or a high D tier in that it's very similar to like Rampant Growth, Cultivate, that type of effect. But it's more abusable. Like if you cast Twin Cast and then Channel the Suns, that's a lot of mana. So the fixing raw power is there, and I think for that reason we're going to put it in C tier. Good old Initiates of the Ebon Hand. This card's a lot of fun. It's not amazing, but it takes 1 generic mana and converts it into black. And you can only do this 4 times or else it's buried. So if you need black mana, it's great, but it really doesn't do much else. I think this is essentially the same thing as the Blue Mana Battery, in that it adds 1 type of mana. But the problem is, it's not colorless, so you need to spend a black mana to cast this, and then this can filter colorless to black. So I'm going to put it in, I think, G tier. Like, if you need it, it's great, but the fact that you need black to cast it, and then activate this basically takes you from 1 black mana to 2. And it's not great. Also, I think we need to zoom out. The tier maker is getting very big. So we're going to zoom out. It's going to get a little bit smaller, but then you can see all the cards down here. That looks a bit better. We might have to do that a couple times. Ooh, Storm Cauldron. So this is a fun card in, again, most of these are commander cards, but each player may play an additional land, and then whenever land is tapped for mana, return it to its owner's hand. So if you have one land, like let's say it's an island, you tap it for blue, you return it to hand, then this lets you replay it and tap it for another blue. So in a pinch, Storm Cauldron can give you 2 mana of one color, or you could do something cool like if you have a dual, you can tap it for like red, bounce it, and then tap it for white. So it is mana fixing. The effect is quite limiting in other things, but from a mana fixing standpoint, I think this is better than Initiates in the Ebon hand. So I'm going to put it in F tier. It's not necessarily a card you would want to play for fixing, but you know, if you've ever played with this in like I think I played this in Borborygmos, where you have like exploration and things, it does help you generate mana of different colors. Okay, Coarser of Crew Fix is an interesting one. This one is actually similar to Card Draw, in that it just lets you look one card deeper. So you get to decide between playing a land from your hand or a land that's on top of your deck. And I think it is powerful. You do hit your mana more often with an effect like this, especially when combined with fetch lands, so you get to reshuffle your top of your deck a lot. But it's prohibitively costed and things like that. So I'm going to put this, from a mana fixing standpoint, it's between F and G tier. I think because Coarser is double green, which is quite prohibitive, I'm going to put it in G tier. This is not commenting on how good of a card Coarser is in general. I think Coarser is a fantastic card, but specifically how well it can fix your mana, I think is at a G tier rate. It's definitely better than Initiates in the Ebon hand, but not by much. Ooh, Utopia Sprawl is nice. So I think Utopia Sprawl is, again, my baseline comparison is something like Rampant Growth or Cultivate. And the fact that Utopia Sprawl, you can put it on an untapped forest and then choose a color and then get mana of that color immediately makes me think it's similar to Channel the Suns in terms of power level. So I'm going to put this at C tier, but this is like a very, very low C tier. I think Utopia Sprawl is, it's hard to say. It fixes mana over time, whereas Channel the Sun fixes mana immediately but very well. So it's somewhere between Channel the Sun and Rampant Growth in terms of fixing capability. Up next, we got Coalition Relic, an all-time favorite in Cube Draft. This card is just unbelievably good in Cube. It just, you know, it taps for 1 mana of any color, which is already exceptional. And then you can put a charge counter to give it 2 mana of any color. It's just really good. I'm going to put Coalition Relic, it's hard to say. It's between a high B tier or A tier. I think I'm going to put this in a very, very low A tier. This is like the fringe between A and B. You'll see why for the other cards in A tier. They fix mana for all of your spells instead of just giving you 2 mana that you might need. But I think it's strong enough to merit being an A. Alright, next we have Armageddon. This card, at first glance, seems like it is the opposite of mana fixing. And you might be correct. But have you ever combined Armageddon with Fast Bond and Crucible of Worlds? Yeah, it's basically Turnabout at that point. So if you have some way to get your lands back, which I think I have a couple coming up, Armageddon can be fixing. It can give you duplicate mana of 1 color, right? You cast Armageddon, you have a mountain, you float a red, you get the mountain back, you float another red. You now have 2 red mana, which you did not have before. It's not amazing, but in a pinch, I've done it. I really have used it as mana fixing before. So we're going to put Armageddon in H tier. It's similar to like Urza's Tower and Trenchgorger in that it's super fringe, but when it works, it's just okay. It's not even amazing. Dark Ritual I think is pretty straightforward. It's very similar to Initiates of the Ebon hand, and then it takes black and makes triple black. So we're just going to put it in G tier, along with all the other rituals of this type, like I think Seething Song is a little bit better, but like Desperate Ritual and things like that. They're all around G tier. And a card that you can cast off of Dark Ritual is Doomsday. So this searches your library and graveyard for 5 cards, exiles the rest, and then you put the chosen cards on top of your library in any order. This is actually pretty good mana fixing because, if you really need a blue source, you can get it. It's hard to cast, but in the right deck, I think Doomsday can fix your mana pretty decently. I'm going to put Doomsday, it's between E and F. Stacking your deck is a strong effect. It's just hard to cast. I'm going to put it in E tier, actually, because you get to stack your deck. So if you need to hit like red and then blue, you can. If you need to take a Coalition Relic and put it on top so you can cast your stuff, you can. So I think that effect is really strong, even though this is not the easiest card to cast. Speaking of cards that do kind of fix your mana with World Shaper, or with Armageddon, we have World Shaper. So when it attacks, you may mill 3 cards. And then when it dies, you get all the lands from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this does 2 things. The first is that it looks through the top of your deck, milling you, and then you get all those cards into play. So it's similar to card draw in that effect. It also works with things like Armageddon, where you can get those lands back. They enter tap, so it's not like the best fixing, but if you had already cast Armageddon, it would fix your mana a bit. I think I'm going to put this at F tier, because it's really slow, right? You have to like attack. You need an enabler to put other interesting lands in your graveyard. It's more of a ramp payoff than it is a mana fixing payoff, but you can use it to fix your mana. Here's a card I'd never seen before. It's False Dawn. So 2 mana, colored mana symbols on all permanents you control and on all cards you own that aren't in play become white until end of turn, and you get to draw a card. So we've said before, card draw is mana fixing. I'll get to that in a little bit, but it also basically says you can spend white mana as though it was mana of any color, which is a pretty strong effect actually, because you could make a lot of things work, but you need a lot of white mana to do it. So you might have to combine this with something that like turns all your lands into plains, because a mono white deck, actually, you know what, this could let a mono white deck cast a 5 color card. So I'm going to put it in C tier for that regard. It's kind of similar to like Utopia Sprawl or Channel the Suns, but for white, and it draws a card, so it's actually pretty nice. So there's like a whole string of creatures with this type of an ability where it's a creature that adds mana to only cast creatures, and they can add like more than 1 mana to do it, and I think that's really, really good. You have to play them and then have them untap, but if you're playing a deck with all creatures, being able to add 3 mana of any one color, or I think there's some others that are like 2 mana in any combination colors. I'm just using Somberwald Sage to represent all of these. I think these are really strong. And in the creature type of deck, I'm going to put them in, I think, B tier. Like, B tier is pretty big. There's a large gap between Manamorphose and Somberwald Sage. But they're for very different types of decks in very different formats. But when you get this in play and start tapping it, it does help you tremendously. Here I'm using Nirkana Revenant to represent, there's like a whole strain of creatures that make swamps tap for extra mana. I think Cryptghast is one. There's a lot of mana doublers with this effect. I think these are similar to Initiates of the Ebon Hand and Dark Ritual in that they they just give you extra black mana. They're really good for ramp and other things, but as far as mana fixing goes, not the greatest. We're finally getting to the good one. So Michelson's Lattice is an example of a solidly A tier card. This is the top of the top, because basically it says players may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. This solves all of your problems. If this is in play, there is no color issue whatsoever. Now it costs 6 to get down, so there's a lot of things. It's an artifact, so you can kill it easily, but when this is in play, you have no mana issues whatsoever. So this is like top A tier for sure. So Rage Monger is a pretty fun card actually. So it's 3 mana for 2/3, and Minotaur spells cost black red less. It only reduces the amount of colored mana, but this is colored mana fixing. So Minotaurs historically are in like black-red colors. So if you can land this, it just means you can cast all of your other Minotaurs without needing black-red mana. So it's great, but it requires you having black-red to cast it, right? So it doesn't like solve all of your woes. It just means you can cast multiple black-red cards without having, like 3 swamps and 3 mountains or something like that. So it's a great card, but there's a big cost to set it up. And for that reason, I'm going to put it's between low D tier or high E tier. And I'm just going to give it high D tier because I like Minotaurs. If you're playing the Minotaur deck, this is good. Obviously, this only applies if you're playing Minotaurs or I guess Changelings. But if it does let you just cast a bunch of them. So that's pretty cool. I could easily see an argument for putting it in E tier though. Next up, we have a card that's very near and dear to my heart, Petalman Baku. I love this card so much. So I made a bunch of Pauper Spirits decks where this essentially single-handedly it was a good ramp source, and it fixed all of my mana troubles. You have to cast other spirits to get it going. So again, there is a cost, but I think this card is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to put it in a solid C tier. You know what? We're going to put it in B tier, actually. It adds 1 mana of any color, and it says... And you can do it a bunch of times. So at the base rate, it filters. You can add mana. I think it's very similar to Somberwald Sage in that type of effect. Obviously, this rating is assuming you've built a Spirits deck. It doesn't do much on its own. But in the right deck, this card can go crazy. Next up, we have a Pauper meme card, Sprotting Vines. So it is a storm card that searches for a basic land card and puts it in your hand. So if a lot of spells have been cast, you get a lot of lands. I think this card, it's hard to say. It's between C and D because it doesn't put it into play, which means you could then put the land into play and get the mana that you need. It's also very good with things like Fast Bond or anything that lets you put a bunch of lands into play from your hand. So I think I'm actually going to put this in C tier. C tier is going to get pretty full, I think. There's a lot of things going on there. But I think Sprotting Vines is a bit better than Rampant Growth in that you can get multiple. And you know what? It's got to be about the same, right? Yeah, it has to be the same because I'm using Rampant Growth to represent like all possible mana fixing. So I guess these are essentially equivalent. Then we have Springjack Pasture. This card, it looks awesome. It's a lot of fun. Making goats is cool. And it's very slow. It's similar to a thing that would like charge up and then add mana, but it's got a lot going for it. It's a colorless land. It makes goats, which is a lot of fun. You can sacrifice X goats and get X mana of any one color to your mana pool. So on its own, you know, it takes a lot of mana in one turn, and then you can get one mana of any color. If you're playing Goat Tribal for whatever it's worth, this can get a bit bigger and better. I think the speed of it puts it around Ash Barrens in terms of like, yes, this can fix your mana, but it's just going to take forever to do it. So I'm going to put it in C tier. But if you get a Goats deck working, first of all, tell me about it because I want to play it. But you know, you could definitely bump this up into B tier. Okay, I had a bit of technical difficulty, so I had to refresh everything, so sorry if things moved a bit. But we're going to get right back to it. So next we have Preordain, and this one's going to be a bit, maybe controversial, I'm not sure, but this gets into the card draws mana fixing thing, or I think Xerox theory, or whatever that is. Just saying that if you can look at the top card of your library and choose ones you like, you can be a bit more aggressive in either playing a lower land count, or playing a fewer number of colors, or sources of each color. So Preordain does all of that. Now, it is a bit limited in that it costs blue. So it's similar to Rampant Growth in that effect, where you need to be in green or in blue to make this work. And I think Preordain's power scales with how good the mana fixing in your deck already is. If you just have a bunch of basics, you know, scrying through basics, it's going to take a long time to get to like a mountain if you only have like 5 mountains out of 60 or something like that. Where Preordain shines is in like Legacy, where you have a lot of duels, and you're always going to be like maybe 1 or 2 cards away from getting the fixing you want. So I think the ceiling on Preordain is actually very high. I think if you're playing it in like Legacy, it's around C tier fixing. But in general, I think, you know, not everyone's playing Legacy or things like that. In general, I think it's going to be like D tier, somewhere around there, D or C. I love this card. Fist of Suns is a lot of fun. So 3 mana, and it says you may pay 5 mana, 1 of each color, rather than the mana cost for spells you cast. It's, you know, it's kind of mana fixing in that, okay, maybe it's not super mana fixing, but I think there are cards that are like triple black. Like sometimes hitting 1 mana of each color is easier than hitting like a triple black mana for Doomsday or something like that. So while this is more for like ramp, because I think casting 1 mana of each color is easier than like 15 mana for Emrakul, it can technically fix your mana. I'm deciding whether I want to put it between F and G tier, because it's not amazing at what it does. As far as like fixing goes, I think I would put it in G tier. It could even be H tier. It's a great card, it's a lot of fun, but requiring 1 of each color before you start fixing your mana is a lot to ask. Ooh, one of my favorites for EDH, Blatant Thievery. For each opponent, gain control of target permanent that player controls. Very straightforward, very simple. And here's an example of something where Fist of the Suns might actually help fix your mana, because it's triple blue. So this card, I think, is actually very similar to Fist of the Suns. It's good if your opponents have good mana and you need it. You can steal, I think in the artwork, they're actually stealing what looks to be like Coalition Relic. The art's very similar. So stealing Coalition Relic, you know, it gives you kind of Coalition Relic mana fixing, but it costs triple blue. So I think I'm going to put it in low F tier. I think it is better than Fist of Suns. It might even be better than Doomsday, actually. Yeah, actually, I want to put it in E tier, because this is E tier for multiplayer formats, because you can just steal, assumingly your opponents are going to be playing, you know, a variety of colors, you can just steal good permanents that you want, and then get mana fixing that way. So I think we're going to put it E tier, probably better than a basic land. Maybe this, you know what, the more I think about this, this is kind of like, we're going into D tier. It's expensive and costly, but when you get it, it does fix your mana quite efficiently, and it's probably does so better than Rage Monger. So it's going to be around this level, I think. Okay, now we have tapped tri-lands. A little bit different than the cycling ones they just released. These are historically very great mana fixing. I play them casually in Cube and Commander. They're ubiquitous and very fun. How good are they? I think they're pretty good. Let's see. So they're essentially colorless that get any mana. I think I'm going to put them in C tier. They're similar to Springjack Pasture, right? This takes 2 turns and adds mana. I guess I probably want to bring up Training Crater because this just enters untapped at any time. I might have to rework these tiers. No, I guess C tier is just very big. So Training Crater is like the high end. It's a land that enters untapped and adds 2. This is a land that enters taps and adds 3 mana of any color. I think that makes sense. It's just a very low C tier rating. Next up is Mindbend. Change the text of target permanent by replacing all instances of one color word with another, or one basic land type with another. So this is 1 blue that basically says the text. So I don't think you can change the converted mana cost. You couldn't change Doomsday to islands like blue, but what you could do is make your island tap for black. So it's not amazing. Yeah, you could just change what things tap for. So that's gonna be, I think, F tier. Well, I guess you could just make an island tap for any color that you would like. We're gonna put it in E tier. You know what? It's going up. It costs blue. We're gonna put it in low D. It's about Preordain's level of fixing, or like Rampant Growth, where it costs blue, but in a pinch, if you need red mana, it can get you red mana. Again, this tier list is not how good the cards are. Like, obviously, you would much rather use Rampant Growth to fix your mana for colors than Mindbend. But as far as like the immediate effect and how well they can get you mana, I think this is around where this card should be. Yes, Blood Moon, a very fun card to mana screw opponents with. It can technically be used as mana fixing as well because it makes all non-basic lands mountain. So if you need a bunch of red and you're willing to spend a red mana to get there, Blood Moon is the thing for you. I'm going to put it in G. Again, it's very similar to like Dark Ritual in that it takes red and makes more red. Not great, but it does a thing if you need it. This one's pretty fun. Crop rotation, sacrifice the land and then get any land into play. This is not just basic lands, it's any land. And it doesn't enter tapped. So I think crop rotation from a fixing standpoint is going to be in low C. Probably on par with something like Crumbling Necropolis. It's a good card for other reasons, like you can use it to tutor up utility lands and things like that. But yeah, I think it's a little bit better than something like Sprouting Vines and Rampant Growth because it's right around here. I'll just put it in these, I guess. It's either low C or high D. I made as many tiers as I could, but there's just not enough of them to actually differentiate between all these cards. Mana Reflection doubles your mana. That's essentially what Storm Cauldron does. Like, that's why I said it was kind of useful. So we're just going to put it in F tier. It costs green, so it's a little bit worse than Storm Cauldron, though. Ooh, we get to the Panorama lands. I am actually a big fan of the Panorama lands. So it adds colorless, which is now relevant. And then you can also search for basic Island, Swamp, or Mountain. So it is effectively a tapped quad land because it adds for colorless or 3. I'm going to put this, I think it's worse than Crumbling Necropolis as far as like mana fixing goes, because Crumbling Necropolis adds 3 mana all the time. Like you can tap for blue and then red if you need to. This requires you to commit, but it does, give you colorless immediately when it comes in, which can be useful for casting like Thought-Knot Seer or whatever. So they have their differences. I think the tapped tri-lands are better fixing in general. Okay, the Vivid lands are kind of a different story. So these are tapped with 2 charge counters on it. They can tap for 1 base color, this one's blue, and then you can remove a charge counter to add 1 mana of any color. I think this is solidly B tier. I think Vivid lands just make mana so easy because, again, they're colorless sources that add mana of any color. They can do it twice, and you can like change your decision. It's just really strong. So I'm going to put this around B tier. I love these cards. Ramos is a fun one. So this card is a legendary dragon. Whenever you cast a spell, you put a counter on it for each of that spell's colors. And then it says remove 5 counters from Ramos, and you add 2 of each color. And you can only do it once each turn. So basically, if you cast 5 different colors worth of spells, you get 2 of each color. I think Ramos is pretty good. I'm going to put him in D tier because it does require some heavy investment. Maybe it is C tier. It's somewhere around here. Because it's good at, like, if you have a very ambitious mana base, putting it over the top. But it's not so good at jump starting that fixing, because you need to get 5 colors worth of spells to, like, activate him. So I think we're going to put Ramos in, like, high D tier for, like, the base rate. If you build a 5-color deck with Ramos, this will make your mana very smooth. So I think in some decks, Ramos is going to be like A or B tier, because you're just casting like Cruel Ultimatum, and then actually, you know what, we're going to put Ramos up into C tier. I think he's good enough. If you can cast like Cruel Ultimatum and then activate Ramos and then cast I don't even know what is those colors, Progenitus, that seems like pretty good mana fixing to me. So it's low C, and then depending on the deck, it could be B or A. Coveted Jewel is a fun one. So it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, and can tap for 3 mana of any one color. So it helps your fixing in terms that it draws you cards, and it adds mana of any color. And there's a little bit bonus, it's like a party fixing in that it gives your opponents fixing too if they attack you. So this is going to be in B tier. I think I'm going to put it somewhere around here. Like, it's a little bit worse than Pacification Array because you can only add 3 mana one time, but it's still an exceptional card, and it's fun that it fixes mana for everybody. Okay, Farseek. So those who haven't seen my latest draft, I tried playing Farseek in mono green. I realized it, but it was kind of silly. This is different than Rampant Growth in that it searches for a land of a basic type, not a basic land. So you can get dual lands or something like that with this card. It still enters tapped, but being able to fetch up like a blue-white dual just gives you a lot more possibility. So I think Farseek in this type of effect bump up into C tier, similar to like Utopia Sprawl and things like that, just because they can get you a bunch of mana. In fact, I think now we have the triomes, the cycling ones, that have 3 different mana types. So being able to Farseek for something like a Crumbling Necropolis is very strong, and I think makes it a little bit better than things like Rampant Growth or Cultivate. So there's actually quite a few things like this. There's Izzet Locket, Signet, Cluestone, and things like that. This one has a lot of modes, so it can add red or blue. And then if you have a bunch of red or blue, you can sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. So I think the fact that it lets you draw 2 over, I think I'm going to come to some that let you draw 1, makes it a little bit better than those. And effectively, it's just an artifact that taps for 2 different types of colored mana. So it doesn't fix for all 5 like something like Sprouting Vines or Rampant Growth does, but it's colorless, so you can put it in any deck. So I think I'm going to put it... it's got to go somewhere around here, I think. It's definitely worse than Springjack Pasture as far as fixing goes, but I think it's better than a tapped Tri-land because it gives you 2 colors and you can draw cards for a 3rd and it enters untapped. That's my reasoning, I'm sticking with it. Oh boy, is this a strong card. So Dockside Extortionist, when it enters, you create X treasure tokens, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. I'm just going to rate this in Commander. I don't think people are playing this in really any other format. In Commander, people play a lot of artifacts and enchantments, so this is going to be like 2 mana, create 8 treasures, or depending on how big your game is, and that is ridiculous. So this is going straight into B tier, assuming you're playing Commander. I think it's definitely better than Somberwald Sage, but kind of on par with Coveted Jewel because it does require you to play red. So Guildgates, all the tapped duels, pretty straightforward. They're a little bit better than basic lands as far as mana fixing goes. I think they're kind of worse than like Praetor and Mindbend. So I think I might just put them like just barely over basic lands, or like kind of on par, because entering tapped is a huge cost. Although, no, I think they're in a solid tier above. It's very close. They're around basic lands, because there are times when playing the Guildgate is just like worse than playing more extra lands. Whereas things like stuff up here, you would just play as many of these as you can get, really. There is a limit to how many Guildgates are useful in a deck. So I think we're going to put it in D tier or E tier, depending on how you're feeling on that day. Wilderness Reclamation is a fun one. This is kind of similar to Mana Reflection and Mana Confluence, where it basically just doubles your mana. So I think we can just kind of straightforwardly put it somewhere around Mana Reflection status. I think a bit worse than Mana Reflection because you only get that mana during your end step. Actually, yeah, you only get the mana during your end step. We're going to put this into G tier mana fixing because it only works for instants. Okay, so Signets are a bit different than Lockets, and here's why. Izzet Signet can add blue and red at the same time. So if you're trying to cast a spell that is Izzet costed, Izzet Locket can't do it because it only adds blue or red, Whereas Is It Signet can let you splash like an entire spell on its own. They're a pain to use on Magic Online because like the tapping is weird, but as far like from a fixing standpoint, they're just a little bit better than lockets or like things that tap for 1 mana of a color. So with the Exotic Orchard, and there's a lot of things like this, they add mana that your opponent's lands could produce. I think this is essentially the same as Blatant Thievery in that it requires your opponents to have a lot of mana. But we're going to rate this as if you were playing in a game of Commander. And in that case, I think this basically taps for 1 mana of almost any color. I think it's essentially on par. It's better than Vivid Creek, let's be real. Yeah, I think it's not completely reliable because your opponents, you know, you might be in a meta where everyone's playing monocolored decks and then Exotic Orchard's kind of bad. But in a meta where people are playing 5 colors, this card's fantastic. It'll just get better as time goes on because, you know, maybe your opponent's stumbling on mana too. So it won't help you early, but I think just the fact that it enters untapped makes it that much better than Vivid Creek, even though it's not necessarily as reliable. Ah, man, I love bounce lands to death, but from a mana fixing standpoint, they're just a little bit better than Guild Gates. So this is the exact same argument for why Is It Signet is a little bit better than the Locket. It just gives you, you know, both colors of mana. So with 1 Boiler Works, you can cast an Is It spell. But, you know, there's a big tempo hit and it's just tapped. So I think it's just a little bit better than the Guild Gate, but not better than Cascade Bluffs for like fixing your mana. So a Rochi Leafcaller, there's actually a couple of effects like this where they filter 1 to anything. This is very similar to, I don't actually remember the name of this card, I can't read it because it's so small. But this lets you basically say like you may spend white mana as though it were mana of any color. This card's like basically identical to that. So it's going to go right there. Uh-oh, we've shrunk again, we're going to get smaller. There we go. Alright, Cage Stun, very similar to other mana doublers, but this one is colorless. So yeah, whenever a land's ability causes you to add 1 or more mana of the chosen color, you get an additional 1. So it's similar to Mana Reflection, but it being colorless makes me bump it up into E tier, I think. Crystalline Crawler is absurd. So for 4 mana, it enters with a +1/+1 counter it for each color of mana spent to cast it. You can remove a counter to add 1 mana of any color. Instant speed, no questions asked. And then if you're just playing a colorless deck, you can tap this to put counters on it. This is definitely in B tier. I think I'm going to put this right around Gemstone Array. Because you're going to have at least 1 mana to cast this. So this filters from any color to any color, and it adds mana on its own. So I think it's somewhere around here, depending on what type of deck you're running. Like if you're running a 5-color deck, it's going to be like the best fixing in your deck. If you're running like a 2-color deck, I guess you're probably not playing this. So for that reason, it's going to be somewhere up here. Ghost Quarter is a fun one. I'm sure we've all been there. You're playing a match of Constructed, and you're like 1 mana short of like winning the game, or your opponent cast an important spell and you just need like a white mana for Path to Exile or whatever, and you have a Ghost Quarter in play and you're like, you know what, we're just going to Ghost Quarter my own land. It's not great, it's a huge card disadvantage and things like that, but it does let you search for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. So, it does the thing. I'm going to put this, it's hard to say. If I'm considering just the fixing and not how good it is, this is essentially like a land that taps for mana of any color. But if I'm considering that you have to kill your own land to do it, then it would be, D or E. So it depends on how I want to make this. And because I put Ragemonger in here, even though in general it's not great fixing, I guess Ghost Quarter's got to go up into like Ash Barrens level. Like it's very similar to Ash Barrens in like letting you fix, even though the cost is high. So again, when you use it to fix mana, it does the mana fixing well. It just costs you a lot to get there. Commander Sphere is a pretty straightforward card. Adds 1 mana of any color in your commander's identity. So obviously this is in the context of commander. You can get 1 mana of any color that you need, and then you can sacrifice this to draw a card. So it is mana of any color, effectively, and card draw. So that puts it for me, I think, honestly, still probably worse than Dockside Extortionist, but better than these green ones. Because it just, it enters, it does its thing. It's very good. Command Tower is very similar to Commander Sphere. They do very similar things. So I think I'm just going to put them right next to each other. I think the land is a little bit better because you don't have to spend mana on it. Commander Sphere can draw a card, but I think being a land and not costing mana makes it just slightly better. So here's a fun conspiracy card. So this says your deck can't have basic land cards and your starting hand size is 5. but you can exile a card from your hand to play basic lands from outside the game, and your lands tap for mana of any color. So I mean, this essentially solves your mana problems, right? Because your lands, all of your lands tap for mana of any color, and you get basic lands. So I think this is just gonna go into like top B tier. Because again, you could run into issues with colored mana. You know what? Actually, this is gonna be A tier. This is like better than Coalition Relic for sure, but worse than Michaelson Lattice. Birds of Paradise is like a multi-format staple. It adds 1 mana of any color. It's just a very iconic card and has facilitated many 5-color mana bases throughout the years. It's fantastic. I'm going to put this like around Utopia Sprawl Channel the Sun's level of fixing, because you can like add 1 mana of one color and then change your mind and get a different one. It's just really good. All right, Emissary's Ploy. So start the game, and before you draw your opening hand, you choose a number, and then you can spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast creature spells with converted mana cost equal to the chosen number. So again, this is like, it's just in play. You don't even have to draw it. You'll just always have it. So it's a very good fixing if you can build your deck around like creatures of a specific mana cost. I'm going to assume that you can, and in that way it's basically similar to Ragemonger, but you don't have to actually spend the mana to do it. So I think I would put it in D, because it's unlikely you're going to have like all 2 drops that you just want to cast for free. In that case, obviously this card can go up to like A tier. Like if your deck is all 2 drops, the best this card can be is A tier, where just everything in your deck is free. But I think the average range is going to be around D tier, so I'll put it there. Regal Behemoth. I never knew this card existed. It seems absurd. When it enters, you become the Monarch, and if you have the Monarchy, you get double mana. That's the definition of win more. It's very similar to Mana Reflection, but I'm going to put it, I think, at the high level of like green costed doublers, because you're also drawing a card every turn, and that will help you hit other colors of mana if you need them. So Advantageous Proclamation is a really interesting card. Your maximum deck size is reduced by 5. Now, this is fixing, right? If your deck is smaller, you're more likely to draw the lands that you have. But how much it is fixing depends on, number one, if you're allowed to have multiples of this, and what your deck size already is. For example, let's say your deck size is 10, and then you play Advantageous Proclamation, your deck size becomes 5. That means your starting hand will have all of the lands in it in your entire deck. In that case, it's perfect mana fixing. So the power of this card really depends on the format you're playing and how good it is there. So we're going to go for like the base rate of like 60 card deck. It's really not going to have much impact at all, but it is kind of free. So I'm going to put it like right around, it's probably F tier actually. In a 60 card deck, it's probably F tier, like 5 cards lower, doesn't change the odds too much. In a 40 card deck, I would put this in like E tier. And then, you know, if you have multiple of these, or if it gets smaller, it bumps up to like B or A tier. Oh, what the hell? Ooh, Ancient Ziggurat's a lot of fun. So add 1 mana of any color of your mana pool, only for creature spells. I'm going to play this assuming that you're playing like a creature-based deck. And in that context, it's basically Command Tower, right? Your commander in this case is just the creatures you're playing. In like a 5-color slivers deck, this is just a land that enters untap, taps for mana of any color. So the upside is in B, and I think a card like this you're not just going to put in a deck with mostly spells. So I'm going to assume it's a creature-based deck. Braid of Fire is a really fun card. So for 2 mana, every single turn you get red and your mana pool for how long this has been in play. So the first time you get to your upkeep, it's been in play for 1 turn, you put a counter on it, you add red, and then you get 2 red and 3 red and 4 red. So it does get out of hand pretty quickly. I'm basically going to put this in the same level as like Blood Moon. I think it's a little worse than Blood Moon at fixing for red because it takes a while. It's an awesome card for other things, like if you want to cast like instants on your upkeep, but as it is, it's around Blood Moon. Okay, backup plan lets you draw 2 hands and then choose one of them. Yeah, so you get to choose which hand you start with out of the 2/7. So it's like a free mulligan. I think it's really good in some decks. I think again this scales with how well your mana fixing is. Like if you're trying to hit a specific combination of colors, or if you just have like one mountain in your deck and you're trying to hit a splash color. So in general, I think this is really powerful. It's very hard to evaluate. I think I'm going to say it's quite strong. It's just a free mulligan. So we're going to put this like low C tier. We'll put it in high D tier because you just get 2 looks at your hand. So it's kind of like drawing 7 in that sense, where you just get the best out of both of them. Yeah, we'll say high D tier. World Knit is specific to limited, but it is again ridiculous. As long as every card in your card pool started the game in your library or the command zone, lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this just fixes all your mana. It's very similar to Sovereign's Realms or whatever that card is, so I'm just going to put it right up there. This one's another ritual, just goes by Dark Ritual, but it's a little better because it adds just more red. I think in terms of fixing, Solemn is just like a step above Springjack Pasture because it takes a turn to get the mana like when you cast it. It is colorless. You know what? I think it's going to be quite a bit above Springjack. It's going to be around Ash Baron's level. I'm going to put it above because you draw a card, but these are essentially similar levels of mana fixing. Solemn's just a better card in general. And on a similar vein, Cold Steel Heart does a very similar thing. I think it's a bit worse than Solemn because it can't die to draw a card. But both of them basically let you choose a color, get mana of that color the following turn. So Plasm Capture I'm kind of treating like a ritual. The hard thing is that it's extremely prohibitive in the casting cost, but it also gives you X mana in any combination of colors. So like once you get it off, you can do some really cool things. I think we're gonna put it in high D tier because again, it's very hard to cast. But if you're playing a ridiculous deck, this card will enable it. Snowfall as a card is wonderful for many reasons. First of all, the artwork and just how unbelievably terrible it is. So cumulative upkeep blue, and then it says islands may produce an additional blue when tapped for mana, but this mana is only useful for cumulative upkeep. And Snowlands tap for an additional 2 blue. Or an additional blue. I guess you get to choose. And that's also only useful for cumulative upkeep. So this card can pay for itself. And if you have other expensive blue cumulative upkeep cards, maybe you have multiple of these, you could pay for those. So it's self-fulfilling in that sense. This is going to go in H tier mana fixing. It's fixing that helps itself to do nothing. So it's really bad, but it is really funny and worth mentioning. Next, we got Maze's End. This card is actually very similar to Springjack Pasture in that, like, you play it, and then you have to activate it, and then you get mana of any color. It does take, like, 3 turns to get there, because this enters tapped, and then the activated ability, like, also enters tapped. So it's a bit slower, but I think the fact that you can, like... it is a bit slower than Springjack Pasture. I'm going to put it in... I'm still going to put it around there, though. It's slower, but it's more powerful, because it gets duels. And the mana that it gets is repeatedly useful, whereas Springjack Pasture, you use it and then you have to start all over. So here's a card that's actually pretty interesting. So this is basically the idea that card draw is mana fixing, but literally the inverse, because the amount of cards you draw depends on how many lands you already have in play, like how many different types. So basically, how good is your mana already determines how much cards you're going to draw. So this is really quite bad mana fixing, because if you're just trying to, like, you know, get like your red mana in a mono blue deck, it draws 1. It is pretty good if you're like a 5 color deck and you have 4 basic land types, though. So it really depends on the context. Like, if, again, 5 color deck, you're playing like duels and stuff, 5 mana draw 4 I think will be good. But in general, the fact that it's inversely proportional to how good your mana already is makes this card really rough for mana fixing. So we're going to put it, I don't know, somewhere around... actually, it's kind of worse than all of these. I'm going to put it... It's a little bit better than Braid of Fire, but I think it might even be worse than Blood Moon as far as fixing goes. I actually don't know why I included this card. I think there are some synergies that, like, untap creatures instead of untap lands, but they're pretty niche, so I'm going to put this in I tier. It really doesn't do much as far as fixing goes. I think that I thought this untapped your lands, because there's something that untaps all your lands, which I might get to, but this is not that. So Secrets of Paradise is okay. If you have a creature, you can name tokens, I believe. Yeah, I believe if you can name tokens with this, then being able to make your tokens tap for mana of any color, like Goblin tokens, is very good. But the baseline is just fine. I think I would put this around like Caged Sun or something like that. You know, you can make like, oh, wait a second. You could put this in a Relentless Rats deck. That would be sweet. But it doesn't really fix your mana in that case. I'm going to put it in E tier. It's similar to Caged Sun, even in a Relentless Rats deck, but I want to put this in a Rats deck now. That sounds awesome. Mind Over Matter it's a really strong card. You choose and discard a card, and then you can tap or untap artifacts, creature, or lands. There's a lot of ways to go infinite with this, but it is extremely, extremely hard to cast, and most of the time it's just going to give you double costs, like double colors, because you're untapping lands you already have in play. So the card is really good, but I'm just going to put it as like a slightly worse mana reflection because it's 4 blue to cast, and it essentially just doubles your mana. This card's sweet. This card, as a baseline, so Gravestorm is a spell I should explain. When you play this, you copy it for each permanent put into a graveyard this turn, and then you can choose new targets for the copies. So if you've had something die a lot, or typically in Commander you would do an infinite like death loop, you search target player's library for card and remove it from the game. Normally you target your opponents, exile their whole decks, and then you win. But you could technically use it on yourself to reorder your library and get, if you really need that red source, you could target yourself, exile everything except for a mountain, and it would fix your mana in that regard. Kind of a lot of work to get there, but if you could do it, it would be good. Part of me wants to put this around Doomsday level of mana fixing, because you can just, but you have to shuffle your library afterward. So you can't even stack your deck. You can just put literally 1 card on top, which makes it really bad. We'll put it in low G tier. All right, is it Cluestone? Very similar to an Is It Locket, but it only draws 1, so I'm going to put it slightly worse than that one, although they're very equivalent. Night Creep is a fun card. Night Creep has awesome art. This card is double black, and it turns all creatures black and all lands into swamps. So I think it's worse than Blood Moon, because it basically gives you double black to add more black. So I don't know. There are some cards that are like 4 black mana, so I could see you using Night Creep to get there, but I think it's more useful than Trench Gorger and Armageddon. Maybe not even. It's really bad. I'll put it around Blood Moon though. Gilded Lotus taps for 3 mana of any color, very similar to Coveted Jewel, but it cannot fix your opponent's mana, so that makes it worse, and it doesn't draw you cards. So I think I would put it like right next to it, but just worse for those 2 reasons. Chromatic Lantern is an exceptional card. I think it's very similar to World Mend or whatever that card is, Sovereign's Realm. So I'm going to put it right up here. Just the fact that I guess this adds mana in addition to your lands, I'll just make it a little bit better than those. It's hard to judge conspiracy cards versus castables, but it's definitely better than Coalition Relic. So Farfinder is pretty interesting. There's a lot of like colorless cards that search for lands. I'm going to put this, I think, a little bit below Ash Barrens, because Ash Barrens can also just tap for colorless on its own. Like both of these cost mana, get you a land and you can put it into play. This one costs more. Yeah, I think I'm going to put it there. So Deathrite Shaman, it does other things, but we're just judging the mana fixing. And this requires you to exile a land from a graveyard to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This is clearly worse than Birds of Paradise, because Birds just adds 1 mana anytime. But I'm going to assume that you're playing in a format where lands are kind of easy to get. So this is not for Cube. I think in Cube or any like limited set, Deathrite Shaman gets much worse. But if you're playing it in, I think it's even banned in Legacy, or at least Modern, or like Commander, things like that, there will be fetches and things like that. This card is basically a Birds of Paradise, but there are some situations where it won't tap for mana. Gigantha's awesome. So this can be a companion, so it will always be accessible in the right types of decks. So in companion decks, I would say Gigantha is like right up there with Manamorphose in terms of power. In a general deck, this is basically green, add 1 mana of any color, and being slower. So, the base rate is like around Channel the Suns, and it can't be spent to pay generic mana cost. So yeah, I think for this one, I'll assume you're doing the base rate. Yeah, we'll make it better, because you can companion, but these are very similar cards, because it's green mana that adds 1 of each color. Channel is sweet, so it's double green, and add colorless for each life you pay. It's an exceptionally broken card for many reasons. From a specifically mana fixing standpoint, this filters double green into as much colorless mana as you would like. So if you want to cast like a bunch of Thought Knot Seers, Channel can do it for you. Now, how good that is actually very, very tough to pin down, because I think it's better than Urza's Tower. No, it's not, because in a colorless deck, you're going to be playing colorless lands. So I think Channel is actually worse than Urza's Tower from a mana fixing standpoint, because you would need to hit double green to then get all of your colorless, and that seems ridiculous. So Star Compass looks like a card that would be good for fixing, but it only adds mana of a basic land you control could produce. So it's like actually worse than these mana doublers because it's only basics, but it is colorless. So like it's a colorless source that doubles your mana like once. From a fixing standpoint, I think I'm gonna put this at high G. No, it's got to be better than World Shaper. I think it's a little bit better than Storm Cauldron, but not as good as Regal Behemoth. Yeah, that seems about right. No, we'll put it somewhere. It's somewhere in here. I'm not actually sure the exact location. Sulphur Falls and things like this to check lands. If you have an island or mountain, they enter untapped. That's actually very similar to Cascade Bluffs, but I think a little bit worse. Because if you have an island, Sulphur Falls can get you like blue or blue-red, but it can't get you red, whereas Cascade Bluffs can. And this doesn't require a mountain specifically. You just need any source of blue or red. And Cascade Bluffs fixes for colorless. So I think Sulphur Falls is just a little bit worse than Cascade Bluffs, but it can enter untapped, so it's better than the Guildgate and Boiler Works. So the obelisks, they're a little bit better than Signets and Lockets because they tap for 3 mana instead of 2. But they're a bit clunky and expensive, so we'll put them right there. And the crystals are very, very similar, but they have cycling. So if you have the 3 colors you need and you're looking for another color, you can cycle it, so it's just marginally better. This might be a bit controversial, but actually maybe it's not that controversial. I'm going to put Demonic Tutor, so this searches for a card and puts it in your hand. It's very similar from a mana fixing standpoint to something like Rampant Growth or Crop Rotation, but I think because you can get basics and non-basics, and you're not like giving up a land like you would in Crop Rotation, I think Demonic Tutor is roughly around Farseek level of fixing. In fact, I guess again, this card depends on how good your mana fixing is, because like if you can just tutor for one of these A tier ones, then Demonic Tutor gets a lot better. But if you're just playing a normal deck and you're like tutoring for a land, then it's about Farseek. So I guess for that reason, I'm going to put it somewhere up in B tier, which means we're getting even smaller. Somewhere around here, I guess, because we're going to assume like you're somewhere in between these. So it can either go up to A or fetch up a card in C. We'll put it in middle of B. Up next, we have Rosethorn Acolyte. So this is like a turbo Birds of Paradise kind of. So the base rate is green, add 1 mana of any color. That's the same level of fixing as Birds, even though it costs more. But then you can also cast it to immediately filter green into mana of any color. So I think it's really hard to say with this one. I think that would make it better than Birds in general. Not as a card, better at fixing, because you have 2 different modes. You have the creature that taps for mana, and then you have the immediate fixing mode. Obviously, Birds of Paradise is a stronger card because it's cheaper, but just from a fixing standpoint, Rosethorn Acolyte has more options to it. So I think it's a little bit better than Birds of Paradise, just due to the flexibility that you can get mana immediately if you need to. Wild Cantor is an interesting one. So this is red-green and filter to mana of any color. It's definitely worse than Chromatic Star. I guess it's a little bit better than Utopia Sprawl because you get the mana. No, I think here's where it's going to go. It's going to go right between. Oh, it's worse than Leafcaller for sure. Okay, it's going to go after Leafcaller because Leafcaller is green and then add 1 mana of a color as many times as you want. Wild Cantor is nice in that you can use red as well, but you can only do it once. So I think the ability to repeatedly filter mana makes it a little bit better. Next up, we have everyone's favorite Oko. And Oko is technically mana fixing. There's a couple reasons for this. There are some things that require creatures to tap for mana. Like we have, I think like, I don't even remember where it is. One of our conspiracy cards lets your creatures tap for mana. Oko generates creatures. So in some ways, those tap for mana. You could also play Oko with something like Gaia's Cradle. Create a food token, make an elk, and now Gaia's Cradle taps for an additional green. And then the last is, obviously, Oko can steal artifacts and creatures your opponents control. So it's similar to Blatant Thievery in that regard, where you play Oko, make a food, swap it for your opponent's Mox or whatever Signet you're playing, and now you fixed your mana. So Oko, yes, he does everything. Where's Blatant Thievery? I want to put him a little bit worse than Blatant Thievery, I think. But because it happens, Blatant Thievery happens all at once, and Oko you can use repeatedly, but it would take a long time to ultimate more than once. We have Chromatic Sphere. This is very similar to Chromatic Star, but if this dies when you didn't activate it, you don't get to draw a card. So we're going to make it just a little bit worse than Chromatic Star, but they're very similar. Terrarian, also a very similar card. It enters tapped, but it adds 2 mana in any combination of colors. I still think it's worse than Chromatic Sphere because entering tapped is a big cost, so I'm just going to put it right behind Chromatic Sphere. Oracle's a very good card. As far as mana fixing though, it's very similar to Coarser of Crew Fix in that you just look at the top card. But I think Oracle letting you play additional cards and only costing a single green does make it quite a bit better. I think I'm actually going to put Oracle of Moldiah in like low, actually like medium D tier. I think it's around Preordained's power level as far as fixing your mana goes, because you're going to see the top card of your library quite a few turns in a row. So, you know, you could hit that extra mountain or whatever you need using Oracle. Abundant Growth is very similar to Utopia Sprawl, but Abundant Growth replaces the land's ability, and Utopia Sprawl, like you get green and the color you chose. So they're very different. I think Abundant Growth for fixing is better because you can change what color you're tapping for, and it draws you a card. So like, you know, you could draw into other lands that you need. So I think it's a little bit better than Utopia Sprawl for fixing. Obviously, not as good for ramp. So Crew Fix is an interesting card. It's a 4/7, and all of the abilities don't really matter except the bottom one. If unused mana would empty from your mana pool, that mana becomes colorless instead. So he is a very slow filter from colored mana into colorless mana. I think that's got to be H tier. I think I actually like Crew Fix less than Channel, but more than Armageddon. So somewhere around there. If you need a lot of colorless, Crew Fix can get you. Mana Confluence, basically like the perfect land. I think it's worse. I think Command Tower should be above Ancient Ziggurat, actually. I think it's better than the Ziggurat, but then worse than Command Tower. So somewhere in there makes sense to me. Blood Moon is really, or Chaos Moon, sorry. Chaos Moon is interesting. So during each player's upkeep, count the number of permanents. If that number is odd, all red creatures get +1/+1, and mountains produce an additional red when tapped for mana. If the number is even, red creatures get -1/-1, and the mountains produce colorless mana. So this lets your mountains either tap for double red or colorless. And I'm assuming if you're building a deck using Chaos Moon as fixing, you have some way to control the number of permanents. So you know you can go between a mana doubler and colorless mana. It's definitely something. I'm gonna put this one as probably just a little bit better than Blood Moon. I don't know. It's not amazing. So Burnt Offering is kind of near and dear to my heart. So I think I'm going to give it a better rating than probably anyone else in the world would, because it's part of my official brand deck. If you haven't seen the deck, I'll put a link in the description. But basically, this sacrifices a creature to add their casting costs in red or black mana in any combination. In my deck in particular, I use Burnt Offering kind of exclusively to go from black to red, and then use that red to like Manamorphose or something else. So this card is actually the backbone of many combo decks for me, and without this card, I would not be able to make these decks work. So that's a lot of praise. That being said, you know, it's pretty limited in what it does. It just filters black to red. So I think for me, I'm actually going to put it in E tier. I think that's higher than most people would because, you know, it's around Dark Ritual Seething Song, but it's just so near and dear to my heart, I have to put it up there because, again, without it, some of the decks I built just would not function. All right, here we have Steam Vents. This is just a little bit worse than Untapped Duels, but you can fetch it up, so I actually think it's better. So, I forget what this is. This is the land that enters untapped in Commander, basically, if you have more than one opponent. Steam Vents has Island Mountain types, so you can grab it with fetches. So I think it makes Steam Vents a little bit better, even though you have to pay life to have it enter untapped. That's not a big cost to pay, really. Sulfur Vent is another one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. Again, useful in a lot of Pauper combo decks. And this is kind of like a tapped tri-land. So I'm going to put it as... it's hard to say. It depends what you're using it for. I think in the context that I use it for, it's better than Crumbling Necropolis because you can add 2 mana at once. So you can fix for blue and red in one turn, and you still get the choice of like, do I want black or do I want blue and red? In most decks, this card's definitely going to be way worse, but you know, this is me talking, the guy who made Fischlbrand. I think I'm going to put it better than Crumbling Necropolis because when it's good, it's very good. Scrambleverse is kind of sweet. So for each non-land permanent, choose a player at random, then each player gains control of each permanent for which he or she was chosen, and you untap those permanents. So let's think of it this way. You have 8 mana, you cast Scrambleverse, everyone gets random permanents, all your lands untap. Oh, non-land permanent. Okay, that's quite a bit worse. I thought it was lands. So that's only good if you're stealing like signets and things, which again, you're only casting this in Commander most of the time. So we're going to assume there are some signets in play, but not a lot. So basically casting Scrambleverse is like maybe a 50% chance at converting 8 mana into a signet, and you have to get rid of all of your things. Yeah, that's solid low G tier, I think. Again, it's very context dependent, but it's not amazing. We finally come to it. The S tier card. So this is a placeholder. This card obviously doesn't fix your mana. But what I mean by as luck would have it is just stupid blind luck. Being lucky is better than any of this mana fixing at all because you could just draw the cards you need when you need them, right? So I'm putting luck in S tier because it's better to be lucky than good. And sometimes, you know, if you were perfectly lucky, you could just put like 3 basic lands in your deck and that would be enough fixing for the rest of your deck because you would just draw them when you needed them. So luck is S tier fixing. Nothing can beat it. No amount of good planning or anything. If you just draw what you need when you need, your mana will be perfect. Obviously you can't plan for it, but gotta somehow fit this all the way up in S tier. There you go. There's S tier. We're gonna keep going though. Alright, Reality Twist is a fun one. So it's very prohibitively costed. It also looks like a chessboard banana. Like, doesn't it look like a banana peel and then this is the banana inside? I don't know. To me it looks like a banana, so I'll call it Banana Twist. And this basically makes all of your lands tap for different colors. So Plains produces red, Swamps produce green, and so on. This is kind of similar to the mana doublers, but it, like, let's say you have... Oh, this doesn't even affect islands? I thought this affected islands. The fact that this doesn't hit islands and you have to cast triple blue to cast it, I think makes it pretty bad. We're gonna put this like G tier fixing. If it did affect islands, I think it would be better because then like if you're playing mono blue and you want white mana or whatever islands would tap for, you could play this and then get that mana. Right now it basically does nothing, so there it is. River of Tears, I think this is like the only land like this. I don't know if there was a cycle. The mana fixing's pretty good. This is, I think, a bit... it's like right around Sulphur Falls' power level, but I think a little bit worse because it enters untapped always, but you have to play lands to unlock black mana, so you can only get blue on your opponent's turn. It's really hard to say because like on your opponent's turn in instant speed, you're going to be like needing blue mana for counter magic and you're going to cast more black spells at sorcery speed, so it kind of works out in that regard. But you do need landfall to trigger it, so it's not as reliable. But I think it's better than the lands that enter tapped, always. Ah, yes, the lovely Crucible of Worlds. I love this card more than I should, so I'll give that disclaimer before I put it somewhere in the tier list. So there's 2 modes for this, basically. The first mode is you cast this for 3 mana, you have nothing in your graveyard. It does nothing. This would be an I tier, because it literally does nothing. Now, if you pair Crucible of Worlds with a fetch land, now you can start getting things out of your graveyard and like get cards out of your deck. If you pair Crucible of Worlds with Armageddon, you now have like a weird turnabout style effect. So it gets better the more things you have in play. I think in general, I'm going to say Crucible of Worlds is similar to Oracle of Moldiah. And that's kind of an arbitrary rating, but basically, you know, a lot of it depends on if you have fetches or not. And if you have fetches, you can get multiple different duels from your deck. If you don't, then you can't. So I'm just going to put it there. But just know that the ceiling's very high and the floor is very low. So again, mid D tier kind of makes sense for a card that could be really anywhere on the list. Prism is fantastic, mana of any color and card draw. It does not tap for mana of its own, but as far as like Commander Sphere goes, like this costs 3 to add 1 and this cost 2 and then you can filter. So I think I'm going to put this actually better than Commander's Sphere because this draws a card and stays in play. This only draws a card after you sacrifice it. So it's going to go right there. The card is exceptional. Chromatic Orry is another, this is high A tier. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. No strings attached, and it also has card draw. So like if you're short on land, this is going way up here. I think this is better than Michaelson's Lattice because it also draws cards. This is probably the best non-luck mana fixing you can get. Prismite is a hard card to evaluate because, again, it's very context dependent. At the base rate, it's 2 mana for any mana of any color. So you lose a lot of mana in the filtering exchange, but you can do this over and over and over again. Whereas Chromatic Star, you know, this is kind of the same thing, right? This costs 1 to cast, 1 to activate, you get 1 mana of any color. So actually, maybe it's not so hard. I'm going to put this right about Chromatic Star's power level. Yeah, I think right around here because it is the same base rate as Chromatic Star, but then you can keep doing it. So if you have like infinite mana of one color, you can turn it into infinite mana of another. Morophon the Boundless is an amazing card. So this is similar to the Minotaur Warlord, where basically like your spells cost less, but this is colorless. So it takes colorless mana, and then everything costs a bunch of colored mana less. I think I want to put Morophon probably in like B tier. I mean, it's really strong. It might even be high B tier. Yeah, we'll go high B tier. So we could put it right there. Time Walk is a fun one. This is a card that I've literally argued casting Time Walk is like mana fixing. And it is. So it lets you play an extra land. So if you have lands in hand that, let's say you have something that costs like 5 mana, like of multiple colors, Time Walk can let you get an extra turn to play a land and then play another land so you can get that mana in play, cast a spell. It draws you a card because you get an extra turn. So it does a lot of things, but it is a bit prohibitive. So like how well it fixes your mana also depends on the rest of your deck. I think for things I'm uncertain about, we're just going to put it in mid D tier because that's kind of the middle of the road. Where is Time Walk? I don't know how I picked it from there, but Time Walk's going in mid D tier around, I think I'll say it's better than Crucible. Lotus Petal is 0 mana, 1 color, no questions asked. Very nice. Not repeatable, so I think it's going to be worse than Prismite, but better than Chromatic Sphere and Star, because it just costs 0 mana instead of 1. Blood Celebrant is the black version of Rochi Leafcaller. Requires a bit of life, but I think, you know, equivalently they're the same. Because it costs life, I'm just going to put it 1 step below, but it is good fixing. Swiftwater Cliffs is just identical to, is it Guildgate, but it gains life, so slightly better. Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds, I think I'm ranking these by art, and Terramorphic Expanse has amazing art. It's basically the same as Farfinder, but a little bit worse because this land will always enter tapped, whereas Farfinder can have it enter untapped. But I think it's better than the rest of these because it's colorless. Smothering Tithe, I'm sure you Commander players out there know this card all too well. This card is absurd. It just turns white mana into mana of any color. I'm putting this, I think actually better than the Dockhand or whatever that card is, the 2 mana that makes treasures, because people are going to be drawing cards in Commander all the time. They're not going to pay mana. You just get a bunch of treasures. Fixes your mana perfectly. This card is absurd. Black Lotus is it's the best one-shot mana source that I can think of. It is fantastic. I'm going to start moving it up while I'm talking. I think it's better than Coalition Relic very clearly, although you can't use it repeatedly. But when you use Black Lotus, it's just an immediate 3 mana of any color. It's exceptional. Here's a very fun and interesting one. So Urza Academy Headmaster. All of his abilities are entirely determined by a website, and I have a printout of what those abilities are. So for the sake of time, I'm sure this video is already very long. I'm not going to read through all of these, but this card does have some abilities that add mana. So like the 20th ability of the +1 is add X mana in any combination of colors, where X is the number of creatures you control. There's another that's like draw a card, then add 1 mana of any color. So there's a lot of cool effects on this. I think we're just going to deal with this the same way I was dealing with any other cards. If it's middle of the road and you don't know what to do, just put it next to Oracle of Moldiah. It's a great card for mana fixing, but it also is 5 color. Oh wait, it's 5 colors. You know what? It's 5 colors. This is going next to Fist of Suns. If this was colorless, it would be around Oracle of Moldiah level, but the fact that you need to spend 5 mana, like one of each color to get there, it's not really doing you too much of a service. We'll put it a little bit better here. The Talisman, I think I'm going to say, is a little bit better than the Locket, but maybe worse. Or no, it's better than the Cluestone, but worse than the Locket, because it also fixes for colorless. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to put it right up less than the Signet, but better than the Locket and Cluestone, because it fixes for colorless, but it doesn't add both of the colors at the same time. Actually, I guess that makes it a tricolor, right? This is basically an obelisk that adds colorless blue and red. Yeah, that seems okay. The temples are nice. They're tapped lands, but they scry so that you can, filter the top of your deck. So they're definitely better than Is It Boilerworks, I think. But I think as far as mana fixing goes, they're worse than Sulphur Falls. And finally, we get to the fetch lands. So in the right deck with the right mana base, fetch lands can essentially just become a 5-color duel, especially now that we have fetchable tri-lands. So Scalding Tarn and all the other fetches that get lands with basic types, I'm going to put, where is Scalding Tarn? Scalding Tarn's here. I'm going to put these all the way up right at mana confluence level, because they effectively add 1 mana of any color, and they don't hurt you every time you activate it like Mana Confluence does. And to a similar effect, we might as well do the duels now. Volcanic Island it's a dual land with both land types that you don't have to pay life to have entered untapped. So it's just Steam Vents, but way better, and it's what makes the fetch lands so good. Dream Thrush is very similar to Mindbend. They both turn a land into a basic land type of your choice, but Dream Thrush does it in a way that you can keep doing it turn after turn. So I'm actually going to put it probably just a little bit better than Oracle of Moldiah. I think it's quite a bit better than Mindbend, just because you can use it over and over. Carnivorous Bloom is a very good card. You can just exile a card from your hand to add double black or double green. So it basically turns all of your cards in hand into rituals, but it requires you having black-green already. So it's very good for ramp, but from a fixing standpoint, it's about on par with a ritual. So I want to put it, I guess, around Wilderness Reclamation as far as power level. Deep Water is kind of like the blue Blood Moon. I'm just going to put it right next to Blood Moon. I think the fact that it has an activated cost is kind of offset by the fact that you can choose whether or not to do it. So I think it's just, I guess I'll say worse than Night Creep, because this is double black to make everything blue. So yeah, it's around that level. Riftstone Portal is kind of awesome. It just, not only does it fix your mana, but it gives all of your lands the ability to fix. So, and you can tap it for colorless too, but normally you're going to put it into your graveyard. It's hard to enable, but when it's enabled, I think this card is better than just regular untapped duels, because it itself, or it makes all of your lands into dual lands effectively. So if you are just blue-green, I want to put this as better than the just straight up untapped duels, but worse than the duels with land types, because it is hard to activate. If you do consider how hard it is to get this into your graveyard, it would probably go down. But generally for this tier list, I'm just deciding that, when this is working, you're going to put this in a graveyard based deck, it's going to be about this good, probably even better actually. Castle Sengir is it's a card. It adds colorless, black, blue, and red, even though those are barely colored. This card's hard to evaluate because it enters untapped, but the filtering cost is so expensive that I think I'm going to say that as far as like mana fixing goes, it's better than a basic land, but I think this might honestly even be just worse than a tapped Guildgate. So I'm going to put it over here. It's cool, and in the right deck you might, want it as an extra tri-land, but I feel like you're better off running Guildgates than spending 2 mana to add a red. Endless Horizons is a fun card, so when it comes into play, you search for any number of planes and exile them, and then at the beginning of each upkeep, you can put one of those into your hand. It's pretty good in that it does two things. It gives you a guaranteed source of white mana, but then you also, if you have white mana and you're trying to get red, you can remove all the planes from your deck and only get red. So it's better than Trench Gorger in that aspect, that you can remove planes and just draw your second color. And it's kind of like a mana doubler in that you're just going to get an endless stream of planes. So I think I would put this in F tier. It's actually quite decent, but it is risky. If someone kills it, you're just out of all your lands. Next up is Rustic Study card, again, mostly for EDH or Commander. This card is absurd. It's very playgroup dependent. If you get a very stingy playgroup, this card is going to be kind of EF tier, but most of the playgroups, I'm just going from my personal experience, want to just do their own thing and have fun. So they're like, yeah, sure, you can draw a card. And, you know, drawing a couple cards is not the best mana fixing, but if you're drawing like 7 cards a turn, or like a turn cycle, that really does help fix your mana. I think Rustic Study is very strong. I'm actually going to put it probably around Gigantha power level. And just that, like, it's blue and you're just going to draw your deck and you're going to find your other fixing, and hopefully you should be able to cast your spells with 10 cards drawn every turn cycle. Next up, we have the Candelabra. This card is really abusable, but like you can use it with mana doublers to just get ridiculous amounts of mana. If you have a way to untap it, it just goes insane. Like if you have multiple Candelabras in turnabout, and you can do some crazy things, but on its own, it does very similar to like what Caged Sun does, in that it gives you double mana that you need. So I think I'm gonna say it's better than Caged Sun, probably better than Doomsday, but not better than a basic land. That seems about right to me. We'll put it like right here. So if Candelabra was good, this card is terrible. 3 mana, untap target permanent, but only use this ability when a blue spell is successfully cast, and only once for each blue spell cast. So basically it turns all of your blue spells into an additional 3 mana untap something. I think that's really bad. I'm gonna put it like around Braid of Fire level status. It's just quite bad. But you know, you can double your mana, and it untaps permanents, not just land. So it does some things. Here's one that's very near and dear to my heart. I like the art. It's a gnome that costs 4 mana for a 1/1, and you spend 4. You tap it to make a plains produce 1. I think when they say generic, it means colorless instead of white mana until the end of the game, and it mandates that you use counters. So it's so bad. I'm putting it in H tier. It's unbelievably bad. I think it's probably better than Trench Gorger. It just turns your plains into colorless. Sometimes you might need it, but it also requires red mana. It's a fantastically terrible card. Ah yes, Arkham's Astrolabe. This card, I mean, it single-handedly destroyed Pauper. I think it's still legal in some other formats like Legacy and Modern. I don't follow the ban list, but this card is the most efficient mana fixing I think they've printed in a long time. It's 1 mana, and it requires you to have a snow mana base, but that's really good for a lot of reasons. Like in Legacy, playing basics is an advantage to get around like Wasteland and things. So you want to have basics in your mana base anyway, and Astrolabe just gets around Wasteland. So there's a lot of reasons why it's good, but from a raw power level, it's essentially just a Prophetic Prism. So I'm just going to put it as a better Prophetic Prism, but that still is like an insane card that should probably not exist, especially at the rate, like the efficiency that it's at. So we'll just put it, man, this tier list is getting big. It goes right there. Nope, right there. Next up is Path to Exile. Normally this card is used as removal, but you can path your own creatures. I'm sure many of us have done it, and you get a land of a basic type. So I'm going to put this right next to Rampant Growth, but it's worse because you have to kill your own creature. So if you don't have a creature in play, this just does not fix for anything. And on a similar vein, Settle the Wreckage. Exile all attacking creatures target player controls. This is again normally a one-sided board wipe, but you could attack with all of your creatures, turn them all into land. So I'm actually going to put this higher than Path to Exile, but I think it's still worse than Rampant Growth because it's situationally like very difficult. You just have to know like the ceiling on this card, if you are trying to mana fix, is actually very high. Warp World is an interesting one. So it's 8 mana, triple red. Each player shuffles all permanents they own into their library, then reveal that many cards from the top and put all artifact, creatures, and lands and enchantment into play, however you want. So this is a hard card to evaluate. The base rate requires 8 mana, so you're going to be shuffling back 8 lands and drawing 8 new ones. So the base rate means like you're likely to hit different combinations of mana. Like we're assuming you're casting this and you're like, you have the red mana but you're looking for green. Well, if it's in your deck, you're kind of likely to find it and hit it. So in that sense, this card is good mana fixing. In all the other sense, it's pretty bad. I think I'm going to put this it's worse than Blatant Thievery, worse than Oko, but maybe better than the Minotaur guy. So I'll just put it there. Yeah, we'll just move it up here. It's really hard to say, because like I think when you're casting this, it is doing more than Preordained would. It just costs like 1,000,000 mana. Prismatic Omen is an interesting card. It gets played a lot in like Scape Shift, things like that, but it basically says your lands tap for mana of any color. If it was colorless, it would be right up there at Chromatic Lantern status, but it costs green, so it's a little bit worse, but you know, spending green to get perfect mana for the rest of the game is an extremely strong effect, so I think I'm going to put it in very high B tier. It's around Manamorphose level, but I think a bit better because it's permanent and it fixes for all colors, but maybe I like Morphon more because it's colorless, so I want to put it high B tier but below Morphon. Squandered Resources is kind of like a mana doubler, but it costs green-black, and the lands die. So I think it's like similar to Wilderness Reclamation and things like this, where it's like a ritual effect. Yeah, I think I'm going to put it around there. Huh, where'd it go? I thought it was at the top of this tier list. There it is. Okay, it's down here. Yeah, so this is going to go right there. Oath of Nissa is exceptional in like Planeswalker decks because it says you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast Planeswalker spells. I'm going to make the same assumption that you're playing this in a deck that's mostly Planeswalker based. So this card, you know, it's going to be much better than it would be in any other type of deck. It costs green, so I don't think it's going to be like solidly A tier, but I'm going to put it in the bottom of A tier or the top of B tier because basically saying you can spend mana as though it was a mana of any color is just so strong. Even though this costs green, I think this enables 5 color Planeswalkers easier than basically any other green card that exists. So from mana fixing standpoint, Prismatic Vista is very similar to Ghost Quarter actually, but you don't have to kill your own thing, but you do have to pay life. So I'm going to put this as better than Ghost Quarter and Terrarian, but I don't think it's better than Chromatic Sphere because this also draws a card. I think it's very similar to those, so it's hard to say which is better. Actually, you know what? I'm going to put it better than all these, but worse than Prismite. That makes sense. And I can use a similar argument for Fabled Passage. It's good. This one enters tapped, so I'm still going to say that this is probably still better than Ghost Quarter, but now that it enters tapped early, it's going to be worse than the Spheres and probably worse than Terrarian as well. Up next is Barbed Sextant. So this card is basically a Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star, but you draw a card later. From a mana fixing standpoint, it's very similar, but just worse. I think it's better than Terrarian though, because it enters untapped. So we'll put it right here. Cryptolith Rite is an insane card. It's very similar to Prismatic Omen in that it's the same cost. When it enters, in a deck that's built to play it, you just have perfect mana now. So I think I'm just going to put it right next to Prismatic Omen, just with the assumption that like you're going to, you know, build a deck that works with this. I think it's going to be a little bit worse because the requirements harder to meet, but it's such a good card. Crumbling Vestige is interesting. So when it enters, you add a mana of any color, and then it taps for colorless. This is a very hard card to evaluate because it depends a lot on the situation. I'm going to treat it as I do in my combo deck. So I play a lot of combo decks where like you're running like 10 land maybe, and you run Crumbling Vestige as Lotus Petal number 5 that also taps for mana later on. So I'm going to rate this around the same level as Lotus Petal because it's kind of like a one-shot fast mana. And that kind of makes sense to me. There's a little bit of upside in that it's also a land, but the downside is that like, you know, you can only play it if you could play land. So I'm going to put it just below Lotus Petal. We're getting close to finishing. I'm getting excited. I don't even know how long this video is going to be, but it's going to be it's going to be complete. We can say that at least. Up next we have Field of Ruin. So 2 mana, sacrifice it, and each player searches for a basic land, puts it into play. And this might be a bit of a controversial decision, but I think Field of Ruin is actually worse than Ghost Quarter for fixing because it requires your opponent to have a non-basic land and you to spend 2 mana. So I'm actually going to put it below Ghost Quarter. And I think as far as fixing goes, Ash Barrens is actually more reliable because you can do this whenever you want. Field of Ruin has some requirements. So I'm going to say it's around this level, depending on like, if you're playing Constructed, you're always going to have a target really. But basically not being able to always fix your mana makes it a little bit worse than Ash Barrens on average, at least in my book. And I guess worse than Farfinder and Terramorphic Expanse. Next up, we have Thawing Glaciers, one of my all-time favorites. This card, it just is such a powerhouse if you're trying to hit land drops. It's better for hitting like land quantity than it is for fixing because it is very slow, but it's a good card advantage engine. I'm going to put this as slightly better than Field of Ruin and Terramorphic Expanse. Actually, yeah, I'm going to put it just before Ash Barrens for fixing because it's repeatable, but the slowness of it does make it not the most practical way to fix your mana, although it's a phenomenal card. If you're not playing this card in Commander, I recommend it. It depends on how competitive your group is. This is at least good in casual EDH. Land tax is really like the white Sprouting Vines. I think it's easier to turn on and consistent, so I'm going to put it just before Sprouting Vines. Right here. Gemhide Sliver and I think Prismatic Sliver. There's two that add mana, like give slivers this ability, but this one I thought was more interesting because it also gives your opponent fixing. So technically this is better mana fixing than the one that just gives you mana fixing. Or like if you're playing Two-Headed Giant, this gives your partner mana fixing and things like that. So this one's more general, fits better for the theme. And I think this card is like very similar to Cryptolith Rites in that like if you're playing this card, you're going to have a bunch of sliver creatures. But it's worse because it's more limiting than Cryptolith Rites because it makes your creatures have to be slivers. But it also taps for mana in its own. Actually, you know what? This taps for mana on its own. So in a slivers deck, I think this is better than Cryptolith Rite for sure. All right, Mox Lotus. This card, it's expensive, but it literally has infinite mana. And then, this is a real card, by the way. It's an uncard, but they actually printed this. And then for 100 mana, you can add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So on its own, you tap this, you get perfect mana of any colors. So it's going into A tier. Obviously, what am I doing here? If you can cast this, you just win. So I guess this card is better than Chromatic Orry if you can resolve it. And I'm just going to say, like, this is under the assumption that you can. You will not have any mana problems. You can cast every single card in your hand immediately. And you don't lose life due to mana burn, even though that was errated, like, many years ago. Next up is Celestial Dawn, a card with some ridiculously trippy artwork. I really like it. It's quite cool. But this card is very similar to one we already saw. I can't actually read the names, whatever that one is. Where, and lands you control are planes. So basically this is 3 mana, lands you control are planes, and then you can spend white mana as though it were mana of any color. It makes everything white. But there's a downside in that you can spend mana, other mana only as though it was colorless mana. I actually think this card is quite strong for mana fixing. So let's say you're like 5 colors, you spend this for 3, all of your lands basically tap for mana of any color. If you have a mana doubler too, that could go really far. I actually think this card's very strong. The more I'm reading it, I think I'm going to put this card in B tier somewhere. Honestly, it's probably about as good as Cryptolith Rite for mana fixing. The mana cost is a bit prohibitive, but yeah, I think this card's actually solidly B tier because it makes all of your lands plains, so that effectively they can tap for mana of any color. There is a drawback, but I'm assuming you're building your deck in a way that you can take advantage of this. Like if you have this card and then like Caged Sun or something that doubles the mana from plains, you can actually get some really good mana fixing going with this. Carnival of Souls is a cool card. Whenever a creature comes into play, you lose 1 life and add black. It's better for ramp than it is for fixing. I think it's similar to like Order the Ebon Hand as far as like how much mana it generates. Actually, I'm going to put it worse than Dark Ritual. I think Dark Ritual adds a lot of black. This adds black, but like slowly and over time. So it's hard to say. It's somewhere in there. Pilipala is a lot of fun. So 2 mana 1/1, and many of you maybe have never seen the untap symbol. So this is 2 mana untap Pilipala to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This card is very frequently a part of infinite mana combos where like maybe you play like Cryptolith Rites, which lets this tap for mana and then you can untap it, so it kind of filters your mana and everything. So the ceiling's high, it is kind of weak, but I'm going to assume you're using this as part of an infinite mana combo. So I'm just going to put it right next to Prismite, even though, you know, sometimes it's better than Prismite because it like actually produces mana. Sometimes it's worse, but overall I think Pilipala is a nice card. I'm going to put it as worse than Prismite though. Oh, Piracy. Such a cool card ruined by how Magic actually works. So double blue, you may tap lands you don't control to help pay for your spells. So when you cast this, it's a sorcery. Your opponent gets to respond. So all they have to do is just tap their lands, and then you can't use this anymore. So I think this was useful back when mana burn was a thing, because it's like they have to decide whether they want to have the lands untapped or not, or to take damage. But now it is, in theory, cool, but literally worthless because they can just tap their lands. I'm going to put it in the bottom of H tier because maybe you could get an opponent who doesn't know how it works and get some value. You know what? I'm going to put this below Armageddon, but higher than these colorless producers, or at least the Snowfall one. Clear the Land is a card I love. It's fun. It's not the best mana fixing, but I wanted to include it because I put this card in basically every green EDH deck. Each player exiles the top 5 cards of your library, and then any lands they hit just go into play tapped. So it can hit lands on top. It's more fun because it exiles like random cards from your opponent's decks, and sometimes people get mad about that. For this deck, it's fine, but not great. It's kind of random based, so I think it's similar to something like Oracle of Moldiah, in that Oracle will eventually see the top 5 and be able to put them into play. So it's somewhere around there, but the card is fun more so than it is good. Edgewalker, very similar to the Minotaur Lord. This makes your cleric spells cost white-black less to play, and it only reduces colored mana. I'm just going to put this below the Minotaur because clerics, yeah, I'll put it below. Clerics can be in other colors. Minotaurs are very much concentrated in black-red, but there are some other green and blue clerics and things like that. So this isn't as good of a fixer as the other one is. Next up, we got Treasure Map. This card is very slow, but it does a lot of things. It scries 3 times, and then it makes treasures. And you get 3 treasures, so you can get 3 mana of any color. That makes this card, very powerful in that it essentially gives you 3 mana of any color, but it is slow. From a mana fixing standpoint, I'm going to put it just below Terrarian, because it adds a lot of mana, but, at a very slow cost. I think that might be a bit conservative, and you could put it somewhere up here, but just taking time, I think, bumps it down a bit. Here we have Jungle Patrol. So this makes a literal wood token. The token is just called wood, which is pretty cool. And you can sacrifice wood tokens to add red to your mana pool. So this is a ridiculously slow way of filtering green into red mana. And I think that puts it high G tier or low F tier. I guess F tier is things that don't tap. This actually puts it at low E tier, because that's similar to Burnt Offering, but just a bit worse. So we'll put it there. Next up is Spreading Seas. This card is pretty bad. It's similar to Blood Moon in that it just gives you extra mana of that color. I think the fact that Spreading Seas draws a card makes it better than Blood Moon. I think I'm going to say it's better than Urza, but worse than Coarser or Nirkana Revenant. Somewhere around there. Just because it draws a card. Up next we have Conversion. So this is a 4-mana enchantment that turns all mountains into plains. It's pretty bad because you're spending double white to make this happen, and you're spending double white every single upkeep to turn red sources into white sources, of which you already had 2. So the only way this is useful is if you try to think how much white. So you're spending 2. So you would need to have 3 mountains and need to cast a triple white card and not have an extra plains. That's so bad. I think that's actually worse than Scrambleverse as far as fixing goes. And I think it's actually worse than some of these in H tier. I'm going to put it worse than Armageddon. I think this card's actually worse than Armageddon as far as mana fixing goes. Phyrexian Altar is a pretty popular card for Commander. Sacrifice a creature, add 1 mana of any color. This is about as streamlined of a mana fixing engine as you can get. Again, we're assuming that you are playing this in a creature deck. I think I'm actually going to put this as low A tier. Probably better than Oath of Nissa, because if you're playing a creature deck with tokens, just putting this into play, you're going to have all the colors you need. Really efficient card. Inventor's Fair has a very high ceiling, because there's cards up here in S tier or A tier that you could fetch up with Inventor's Fair, but you would need to have those in your deck and have the manas to get there. So I think we're going to be a bit conservative. It's not quite middle of D tier level, because it is going to be just good all the time mostly. You're going to have an artifact deck. So I think I'm going to put it around Solemn Simulacrum, or maybe right next to Pilipala, because basically you can use this to fetch up a good artifact, and that is kind of like mana fixing. So we'll put it, yeah, we'll put it right below Pilipala. That one's kind of arbitrary though, because it really depends on like your deck. Lotus Cobra is a silly card. I think people who play Standard right now know this all too well. This is definitely better than Birds of Paradise because you can like play it and a land on the same turn. You don't have to wait for it to untap. You can also play multiple lands, like Lotus Cobra plus Fetch Land is very strong, or like with Rampant Growths. And then, you know, if you do ridiculous things like whatever's going on with 4-color Omnath right now, this card's just really efficient at what it does in the ceiling so high. I'm going to put it better than Somberwald Sage and Petalmane Baku as far as like mana fixing. Actually, you know what? We're going to put it right around Gemhide Sliver. Just a little bit under Crippleth, right, I think. Yeah, it's right here, between Metamorphose and Celestial Dawn. Birchlore Rangers, I'm kind of ranking this similar to the Sliver card, Gemhide Sliver, but this is a lot better for many reasons. The first is that it allows you to activate your elves without having summoning sick, like while they're still summoning sick, and it costs 1 mana. So it's like a worse mana production rate than Gemhide Sliver, but you can do it immediately. You don't have to wait to untap. You're going to have a bunch of Swarm of Elves. So I think I'm going to say that it is better than Gemhide Sliver and Omen. Assuming you're playing an Elves deck, this card just, it's the thing you want to draw every time. Reclass the Paths is interesting for many reasons. The baseline is just reveal until you hit the top card of your library, and if it's until it's a land card and you put it into play, and then if you clash, you get it back. So it's kind of like a Rampant Growth, but with more randomness. You don't get to choose. So that would make it about as good as like Clear the Land, Oracle of Moldiah, middle of D tier. The interesting thing now is they printed double-faced land cards. So you can cast Recross the Paths without any lands in your deck. And this says you put those cards on the bottom of your library in any order. So if you are running a deck without lands in it, or you have like double-faced land cards, you just get to order your library. So you can basically, you know, put any sequence of draws you would like to into your deck. So if you're playing it for that regard, this card is insane because it's 3 mana, fix your deck. You can get perfect mana. So I'm actually going to put this very highly. I'm sure, you know, that interaction might get banned or something like that, but being able to stack your deck for very cheap, I think I'm actually going to put this in A tier because not only is it fixing for now, it's fixing for the next turn and the next turn and all the turns going forward. As long as you can plan ahead. I think the ceiling on this card is really high because you're just stacking. You choose all the cards in your deck in order if you build your deck. So again, in a deck where you have no lands except double-faced cards, I'm putting this as like the bottom of A tier, or it's probably high B tier. And then if you're just playing this regularly, it's right next to Clear the Land. Fiery Islet is pretty straightforward. It's like an untapped duel that has no like land types, but you can also draw a card. So I'm actually going to put it, as far as things go, above the untapped duel. Even though you do pay life, I think that's not a huge cost, just because you can trade it for a card if you're like looking for green mana or whatever your other colors might be. Hall of Gemstone is a pretty cool one. First of all, look at that artwork. I have no idea what's going on, but that dude has a lot of chalices. And second of all, it does something pretty unique. At the beginning of each upkeep, you choose a color, and then at the end of turn, until the end of turn, each mana producing land makes mana of that color instead of the normal color. So it's pretty cool. And it also fixes for you and your opponent, or you know, your teammate. So it is marginally more fixing, even if that fixing is bad for you. I'm going to place this, I think, a little bit higher than something like Solemn Simulacrum, because it's fixing for only one color and it does cost double green, but you can change what color that's going to be. Next, there's Overlaid Terrain. This is a pretty strange one, and I'm actually glad I had never seen this card before, but it's so cool. 4 mana, when it comes into play, sack all lands you control, and then your lands can tap for 2 mana of any one color. Like, each one can choose. So the cost is very high, but the reward is good too. I think this card, for me, is very similar to Plasm Capture. They're both like expensive, kind of hard to cast, like a big cost. But when you get there, like if you go like Overlaid Terrain with Crucible of Worlds in play or something, that's a really, really big payoff. So I think, you know, some of these I said like you build your deck, so you're going to assume it's very good. This one, it's like you can't just assume that you have Crucible of Worlds in play. I mean, if you have this with Crucible of Worlds in play, obviously this jumps into like B tier. But I think on its own, if you're just playing it for value, it's going to be around E tier. But if you have any like kind of marginal synergies or just a lot of lands in your deck, this card is going to get pretty good over time. Next up is everyone's favorite card, Ancestral Recall. So how good does Caleb think Ancestral Recall is for fixing? Well, I would say it is exactly better than Preordain. So Preordain scries 2 and draws a card. So you can look through the top 3 to find fixing. Ancestral Recall just gives you all of those. So like if you Preordain and see 2 different colored lands you'd like, you can only get 1 immediately. Ancestral Recall can give you all of those right away. So it's just better than Preordain just because it draws more cards than Preordain hits with its scry plus card draw. So it's really just a measure of how many cards you get to see with this. Up next, we got One With Nothing. This card is surprisingly better than some things on this list. Yeah, it's fine. 1 mana, discard your hand, instant speed. So what can you do with this? Well, if you have a Crucible of Worlds, you can discard your hand and then put them back. If you have something like World Mender or World Shaper, you can like attack with World Shaper. I keep forgetting it's when it dies. Like basically you hold up One With Nothing, and then when World Shaper dies, you discard your hand and then put all those lands into play off the trigger. Or Mending of Dominaria, we'll get to in a second. It also just puts lands into play. So there are some combos here where you can put all the lands from your hand into play. And I'm sure there are plenty others I'm not thinking of. But basically it's an express way to put things in your graveyard. And then from there, there's good ways to cheat them into play. So it's not great, but I think it's honestly a better enabler than this thing that's in the bottom of G. No, it's still worse than that. I'm going to say it's slightly worse than Armageddon, but probably has actually more uses than the thing that turns mountains into plains that's in very heavy white. All right, this one, Carpet of Flowers, is very good in some formats. Like Legacy, there's a lot of islands being played, so a lot of this time, this is just going to be like green, add 2 or 3 mana of any color to your mana pool every turn. In Commander, you get to choose amongst opponents, and maybe one of them has a ton of islands, so it's going to be very strong. I'm actually going to put this in A tier. I think it's around Phyrexian Altar level of power in the formats that it's played in. Because you can do this second main phase, it doesn't say during your first main phase, so you can play it, go through combat, get mana during your second main, and it just fixes quickly and it does it repeatedly, so it's a very, very good card. Stormcrow is actually mana fixing, and it's mana fixing because it is a 1/2 creature that blocks. So let's say your opponent's attacking you, and they have like a 1/1 flyer, you play a Stormcrow, that buys you more time because you're going to stay alive for longer. That lets you draw more cards by just being alive in the game for more time. So having a creature in play is intrinsically mana fixing because the longer the game goes, the more lands you're going to be able to draw and just the better your mana is going to be. It's similar to like Advantageous Proclamation. Just the more cards you see, or effectively the smaller your deck is, the better your mana will be. So I think Stormcrow is actually like probably worse than Trenchgorger as far as mana fixing goes, but better than Urza's Tower. Then we get Parallax Tide. So 4 mana, remove a fade counter from it to remove a land from the game. And then when it leaves play, each player returns all cards they own removed from the game with Parallax Tide into play. So this is kind of like a mana doubler, and it takes a lot of work to get going, but it's better than some of the other cards. So I'm going to put this in F tier, but yeah, it's hard. Because this one, the upside is actually quite high. If you can keep like looping it, you can actually get a lot of mana fixing by like recycling all of your lands over and over. And I think that's better. No, I think that's better than Wilderness Reclamation. It's worse than Wilderness Reclamation and these, but better than the Rituals. For mana fixing, no, it's worse than the Rituals. I'll put it right here. That seems quite reasonable to me. Quicksilver Fountain is cool. It turns lands into islands, but very selectively, and it actually, you have to wait until your upkeep. So I think I'm going to put this like slightly worse than like Blood Moon and things like that, because those happen immediately. It's, you know, it has actually kind of a useful card for mana screwing people, but the fixing is very slow. But it is colorless. You know what? Actually, it's colorless that adds blue. That bumps it up to bottom of F tier, because it is colorless that adds blue. Actually, I guess that was the thing I said for Mana Battery, right? So somehow this card has to go here because it's 3 mana colorless that starts letting you add blue mana. Sure, we'll put it there. Allurin is a wonderful card. This card is very fun. So it's each player may play creature cards with CMC 3 or less without paying their mana cost and as though they had flash. So essentially, if you put this in a deck, you're going to be playing all creatures that cost 3 or less. So this is the same situation where we are assuming you build your deck in a way that it's good. And if you're doing that, I'm going to say Allurin is around Oath of Nissa level good, because it just says not only do they cost less, actually I'm going to put it above Oath of Nissa and Carpet of Flowers, because not only do they cost less, they cost nothing. So you could just cast all of them, you know, immediately. So the fixing in the deck it's good for is so good, but it's very narrow. So it might seem weird to see this at the high of A tier, but that's why. In the decks that you've built it for, it does whatever it needs to do exceptionally well. Next up, we have the Mending of Dominaria. So this card says mill 2, then you may return a creature card from your graveyard to hand, and then you return all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is very similar to World Shaper. It's something that combos with things like One with Nothing, so it's a good enabler. But it also does the things like pretty well on your own. I'm gonna put this. You know, it's quite good. I'm gonna put this probably around Oracle of Moldiah status, because you're looking at the top 4 and then putting lands into play. I guess that makes it worse than Clear the Land, huh? Because Clear the Land looks at the top 5, this looks at the top 4. But this has upsides if you have things in your graveyard and stuff. So yeah, sure, we'll put it around there. Next up is Brass's Bounty. For 7 mana, for each land you control, create a treasure that can add 1 mana. This card is very good. It's very abusable. Like if you cast this and then twin cast, or you have like one of the enchantments that double cast things, this card can just go off very quickly. And it only requires 1 red. So I think I'm going to put this somewhere in like low B tier, because the requirement is that you just need red and then lands. And it just gives you a bunch of treasure. You can get perfect mana from there and out. It's expensive and slow, but when you can do it, it's very good. Next is Mox Diamond. So this is it's like the best Mox for fixing. It's 0 mana. You have to discard a land card, but then if it would be put into play, I don't know what I'm saying. It's a 0 mana spell that taps for mana of any color. I'm actually going to put this better than Command Tower for fixing, because it lets you play like a land and Mox Diamond in the same turn. There are good ways to abuse it. It puts lands into your graveyard. If you have something like Crucible, you can keep fetching. It's a really nice card. It fixes, you know, the cost is there. You have to discard a card, so you're down a card, but the fixing is just so strong. Next up, we have Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. So Emrakul, obviously it's a strong card, but it also can be considered mana fixing. At the base rate, Emrakul does let you take an extra turn. So it's kind of like casting Time Walk. It's a creature, so it's at least as good as Stormcrow when it's in play. And it's much harder to kill. So I'm going to put Emrakul as slightly better than Time Walk as far as mana fixing is concerned, just because it's a creature that can block stuff. And it gives you an extra turn. The only reason it's not higher is that it costs 15 mana to cast, which is not an easy task. And if you have 15 mana and have not hit the colors you need, you might have some other issues, but you know, it does something. Up next, there is Food Chain. So this card, there are some combos with this. Creatures you can cast from exile go infinite with this, but basically it says exile a creature you control, and then you add X mana of any color to your mana pool, where X is the creature's mana cost plus 1. So it's pretty cool. You can only spend the mana to cast creature spells. So, you know, it is a bit limiting, but I think I'm going to put this card, I think bottom of B tier. This is cards with a very high ceiling, but require things. Like, I think it's worse than Somberwald Sage, because this is the mana fixing engine on its own, whereas Food Chain requires creatures, but Food Chain can be activated more times. So it's hard to say, but I think it's a little bit worse than Sage in general. I don't know. I put Allurin in A, so it's hard to argue, but I think here is kind of where it belongs. So we're going to knock 2 out together. Those are Bubbling Muck and High Tide. Both of them just say until end of turn, swamps or islands tap for an extra mana. And I'm just going to rank them similarly, even though I think High Tide's a much better card because the ceiling's higher. But okay, we'll go about one by one. So Bubbling Muck, it's similar to a mana doubler like Dark Ritual and things like that, where basically it's black and it gives you extra black. So I'm going to put this like near Nirkana Revenant, because it requires like Bubbling Muck and a bunch of swamps, and I don't know why you would need like that much black mana. High Tide, Yeah, actually for fixing, you know what? I'm going to put it right here. A little bit better than Bubbling Muck, but again, who needs that much blue mana? Yeah, that seems about right. Next, we have Mon's Goblin Waiters. So this is again similar to Bubbling Muck in that it turns things into a bunch of red mana, but this is better in that it only costs red and you can sacrifice anything to add a half of red. So like if you want to turn one red into a bunch of red, this is a good card. I'm going to put it as probably worse than Seething Song because you would have to sacrifice 10 permanents to add as much red mana as Seething Song does, and that's a lot to ask, but it's fine. I'm actually pretty fond of Elsewhere Flask. It's 2 mana when it comes into play, draw a card, so that's already like a decent rate. And then you sacrifice it and turn all lands you control into lands of that type until end of turn. So if you need a bunch of mana of one color, this can do it. You get to draw a card. I'm going to put this just before Hall of Gemstones or whatever that card is that let you choose what type of lands what type of mana your lands produce every turn. Because this is colorless, so it makes it like easier to activate and more flexible. Caldera Lake might get some weird looks where I put this, but I'm actually going to put this higher than Swiftwater Cliffs in the mana fixing scale. And I know that sounds weird, but it's because it taps for blue-red and colorless. So yes, you know, it's worse. It's a worse card in general, but in a deck where you're needing more fixing, Caldera Lake does more, and it will be significantly better than the Guildgate or Swiftwater Cliffs. Next up is Metamorphosis. This card is kind of like another ritual. It's green, sack a creature, and then you add X mana of any one color to your mana pool, where X is 1 plus the sacrifice creature's mana cost. I think this is like bottom of E tier. First of all, you can only use it to cast creature spells, which is not great, and you can't like choose the ratio of like mana you'd like to add like you would with Burnt Offering. But it does things a little bit better than F tier in that you can add mana of a color you don't have access to with your lands. Next up is Bad River, and there's a whole cycle of these, although I don't know if it's completed because I couldn't find the blue-red one. The difference here is, so these are tapped fetch lands, but they can still find non-basic lands. So you can still use this to grab a dual land. So I think I'm going to put this slightly above, let's see, where's Terramorphic Expanse? Yeah, I'm going to put this slightly above Terramorphic Expanse. It's probably better than Thawing Glaciers. Yeah, better than these. I'm going to put it just worse than Elsewhere Flask because taking it a whole turn to get this in play is a big cost. Then we have Kudzu, a really, really fun mana fixing card. Enchant land. When it becomes tapped, you destroy it, and then whoever controls that land attaches it to a different land. So if you're the controller, you can tap a land, kill your own land, attach it to another one of your lands, kill your own land, and keep doing that process. So it's pretty cool. I think I'm actually going to say that this card is better than Armageddon as far as mana fixing goes because you can selectively destroy your land. You don't have to kill all of them, and you can do it multiple times a turn, right? If you want to, like, let's say you only have a single forest in play, or I guess you need 2 green. Let's say you only have a single mountain in play and you want to get double red. You can attach it to your mountain, sacrifice it, bring your mountain back into play, and then sacrifice it again. And then next turn you could do the same thing if you have Crucible of Worlds. So it's a little bit higher because you can keep activating it over and over. Lion's Eye Diamond is a silly card. So yeah, it's basically Black Lotus, but you have to discard your hand. Now, one would think that's a downside, but sometimes it's actually an upside, which is ridiculous. I'm going to put Lion's Eye Diamond just below Black Lotus in terms of mana fixing, because obviously like it's not as generally versatile as Black Lotus. But we're making the assumption that this is in the deck that's using LED. And like the Storm decks that use LED, you just crack LED and then you flashback things from your graveyard. So you don't even care, you know, that you're discarding your hand. And sometimes it lets you turn on Grim Tutor. I think it's Grim Tutor. Infernal Tutor, the one that like searches if your hand is empty. So like it's better than Black Lotus at turning on that type of tutor effect. So it's an insane card. I think people played in like Legacy with Companions when that was going around and it was just Black Lotus. So I think it's worse than Black Lotus, but there are a lot of situations where it's actually a better card than Black Lotus. Next up, we got Mindslaver. This card is very variance based. You get your opponent's turn, so we're assuming you've activated Mindslaver. How good is this at fixing mana for you? And a lot of it depends on what your opponent has in their hand, right? They could have something that lets you put lands into play, or something like Ancestral Recall targeting you. There's a lot of things they could do, like Path to Exile your creature. So the upside is they could do a lot of really good things, but the base rate is probably you're just going to win the game, which you could argue is mana fixing, and I'm going to use that a bit in this justification, because winning the game is mana fixing. I guess I'll make that statement. I'm going to put it just below Warp World, which is also quite variance based. Basically, I think Warp World has better hits, whereas Mindslaver will just win you the game rather than fixing your mana. But I think winning the game still counts as at least above an E tier of mana fixing. So I thought I was gonna do all of these, but like a lot of these are extremely redundant. So like I'm not gonna go through all of these. I guess we'll do Abundance next. But I'll add these to the tier list that you can like download when I'm done. So if you want to see where I've placed all of these cards, you can. Abundance is great. So 4 mana, if you would draw a card, you can instead choose land or non-land, and then draw until you hit a land of that type. So if you're looking for lands, this can draw you a land. It's not necessarily the land of the color that you want, but it's still quite good in that regard. So the base level is probably better than Oracle of Moldiah, but worse than Rampant Growth. That seems... yeah, that seems about right to me. That seems okay. I'm going to mention Winter's Night, even though it's a bit redundant, because it's a card I've never seen before and it's kind of awesome. So it's Naya colors. Whenever a player taps a snow land for mana, they get an additional mana of any type that land produced. Then the land doesn't untap. So it's kind of like a ritual-based thing, but it's really, really good. And in an era where snowlands are not played as much, this could be quite useful. But it's already Naya colors, and then it's just a mana doubler in those colors. So I'm going to put it like kind of worse than like Cadaverous Bloom or Squandered Resources, but it's still a really cool card, and I thought mentioning it would make sense. And then there's Gateway Plaza. So this is a tapped land. You have to pay 1 mana even when it enters, but it taps from any mana of any color. So it's quite slow and expensive. I'm going to put this, as far as mana fixing goes, I think it's better than Maze's End and Springjack Pasture, but worse than Wild Cantor and the Orochi Leafcaller, just because it's so slow. It's surprising how many effects there are like this. I have like a couple in here, and I'm just going to go through them as if they're this one. 6 mana, Cumulative Upkeep 2. If a land is tapped for mana, it produces colorless instead of any other type. This is very similar to like Channel as far as mana fixing goes, in that it's double green and it helps you get more colorless mana for whatever reason, if that's what you want. So I'm going to put it below Channel because it's like way more expensive, but it's cool like to point out for like Commander, if you want to lock everyone out of like having the ability to cast spells, it could be worth maybe doing. Here we go. Naked Singularity is the card that I thought that the banana card was a banana split, reality split. This is the card I thought it was. So this switches every land type, right? So plains produce red, islands produce green, swamps produce white, and so on. So all of them are switched, and it's colorless. So basically, if you have like blue-red, and you're trying to get access to green. Yeah, blue-red wouldn't work. So it's kind of niche, but you would need like 2 lands and then it would like cycle to the other ones. I think this is actually better than a basic land at fixing because it's kind of situational. If you need the mana, you can cast it and then get the color like fixing. And if you don't need the mana, you can't. You can also decide whether or not to play the cumulative upkeep. So I want to put this at the bottom of D tier. I think it's better than something that just adds 1 mana of colors, because there is a possibility that you get more value. The card's terrible. I'm just saying, like, assuming you just have this effect in play, what is the most effective it can be at mana fixing? And I think the most effective would be D tier. Being more realistic, this would be bottom of E tier. Yeah, okay, fine. Bottom of E tier. That's more realistic, I think. Croesus' Catacombs. This is a lair, so there's a cycle of them. Basically, it's a tri-land that requires you to return a non-lair land to hand whenever you play it. It's just like the worst tri-land ever, so I'm just going to put it below all these tapped duels. It's probably still better fixing than Swiftwater Cliffs and Guildgate, but it's so unbelievably slow. Yeah, I'll put it somewhere around here. I think it's worse than the Boiler Works. No, you know what? It hates me to say it, but I think it's bottom C tier, because it does add 3 different mana of colors, and that's more than all these can offer. It's just really slow, but I like it. I think it's worse than Grixis Panorama just because of how slow it is. And obviously worse than Crumbling Necropolis. This one's pretty interesting. So Devi Excavations, if it would come into play, you have to sacrifice an untapped island instead. Sacrifice it. And then if you do, it comes into play. And it comes into play untapped. That's actually pretty cool. So you can tap it to add colorless blue to your mana pool. And then you can look at the top card of your library. You basically get to scry one. As far as fixing goes, I'm going to put this just above basic land. So I guess I'll just put it in bottom D tier. Because this does fix for colorless, which is important, and you get to scry. So if you're looking for an extra color, this can definitely help you get there. Again, it's very expensive, and you would put basic lands in your deck over this, but from like a baseline mana fixing standpoint, this does more than a basic land does. Anyway, I think that's gonna do it for this tier list. I'm pretty exhausted. This took way longer than I had anticipated it would. I'm gonna go ahead and put all these extra cards in there, and I'll just talk about them like very quickly. Lightning Bolt and Healing Salve are similar to Stormcrow. They help you stay alive. These are some like really bad fixing. Reset, untaps your lands, so it's very similar to like mana doublers. Smoke Braider is pretty interesting. It's similar to, actually we'll talk about Smoke Braider. Alright, my graphics card is really struggling right now for whatever reason. Probably because I recorded a bunch of tiny clips. Don't recommend that. Anyway, Smoke Braider, it's a pretty good card. 2 mana to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. So again, we're going to be going under the pretense that you're like playing an Elementals deck. I'm going to put this kind of just below Cryptolith, right? Actually, no, below, just above Somberwald Sage. Because this helps fix your mana tremendously, because 2 mana in any combination of colors is better than 3 mana in one color. But this is very limited to just elementals, but in that deck, this card is unbelievably good. Like, you play this turn 2 and your mana is just set for the rest of the game. Anyway, we can go through the rest. I think Grinning Ignis filters red for colorless. This card is like 7 mana to untap a land. It's really bad. Second Sunrise is similar to Crucible of Worlds in that it just gets things back. This card, I don't even know what it is, but it filters everything into colorless. Birthing Pod's pretty interesting. Everyone knows what it does. It just lets you kind of cheat on mana. This card filters for Wooburg, and then, yeah, this turns something into a forest. This adds mana of any color. Like, they're all just very similar to things you've seen before, so I didn't think they were worth talking about. I wanted to make Omnath memes, but then, like, he didn't get banned, and I was surprised, so, Omnath is very good. Probably better than Lotus Cobra, but it's not really worth talking about here. So I'll put those in and share the tier list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. This is the definitive mana fixing tier list. It's quite complete. There's only one thing in I tier. I figured there would be more, but I guess I is like completely useless. So it does not fix mana, which is only there because I put the wrong card in the tier list thing. Interesting that there are cards worse than one with nothing for mana fixing. That's quite fun. Anyway, that's it. That'll be all of it. I'll put the tier list in the description, and if you enjoyed this video, want to see more of this, please let me know. This one took a lot of time to make. I will probably make them more reasonably length going forward, but if you got this far, let me know that you would like seeing more and you watched the whole thing. See you guys next time.